Before you even stepped foot inside a Georgian ballroom, your fate was sealed by a piece of paper no bigger than a folded handkerchief, the invitation. A delicate little rectangle capable of determining your social standing, your marital prospects, and apparently your family's collective blood pressure. Because in Georgian society, invitations weren't just slips of parchment. They were declarations of who mattered, who was rising, and who had the audacity to attempt social mobility without permission. The good news, you're invited. The bad news, so is every person who might judge you. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The process began long before you even held the invitation in your hand. Families spent weeks, sometimes months, cultivating the right amount of visibility to be considered worthy. Visibility, in this case, meant showing up at the right parks, bowing at the right people, being seen at the right windows and pretending you were wealthier than your bank account dared to dream. Invitations were not given lightly. They were distributed with the precision of a military campaign. The host had to balance rank, familial alliances, political interests, and of course, the deeply strategic art of excluding people they disliked while appearing perfectly polite. Receiving the invitation itself was an event. It arrived by hand, delivered by a servant who had probably walked more miles that week than you had in your entire life. Families acted shocked. An invitation? For us? How unexpected! Even though they had been dropping hints for months, like casually reminding the host of that lovely afternoon we shared in Bath, despite the fact that they had only exchanged 2 words across a crowded tea house. The parents would hover around the envelope as if it contained treasure, forbidden secrets, or perhaps a bill they hoped wasn't theirs. Opening it was a ceremony. Everyone leaned in, holding their breath, as though the paper might explode. Inside, the invitation always sounded serene and refined, words like cordially, graciously, honoured, and presents requested. All elegant ways of saying, please attend so everyone else can inspect you like a decorative object we may or may not approve of. The pressure was especially intense for young women entering the marriage market. The invitation wasn't just a social outing, it was the preface to a potential life contract. Declining an invitation was technically allowed, but in the same way, jumping from a moving carriage was technically allowed. You could do it, but you'd regret everything immediately. Families responded with a level of panic usually reserved for emergencies. Mothers calculated the political implications of who else might attend. Fathers grumbled about expenses. Aunts began speculating on whether Cousin Charlotte's infamous fainting episodes would ruin the evening. And siblings? They simply watched the chaos unfold like a very polite domestic opera. Even the family dog could sense the tension and tiptoed around the room, questioning why humans made such dramatic noises over stationery paper. And then there was the fear of not receiving the invitation. Social exclusion in Georgian England had its own special flavour. Quiet, devastating, and served cold. If you didn't receive an invitation when everyone else did, you had to pretend you wanted a quiet evening at home anyway. You might say things like, "Oh, we planned a peaceful night of reading," while inside your soul curled up like a startled hedgehog. Missing a ball wasn't simply missing a party, it was missing the opportunity to be seen, evaluated, whispered about, admired, judged, matched, or strategically paired off with someone carrying land and a moderately pleasant face. Even worse, invitations served as quiet social ranking systems. People compared them like trophies. Who got invited first? Who received an invitation written by the host's own hand? Who was granted the honour of staying late? And who, horror of horrors, received an invitation without the courtesy title written correctly? If your Miss became Mrs., or your Esk was missing, the embarrassment could power an entire season's worth of family gossip. The real secret behind Georgian invitations was how much they revealed, not just about your social standing, but about the host's intentions. Inviting a newly wealthy family signalled a desire for economic alliances. Inviting titled guests showed off prestige. Inviting too many people could appear desperate. Inviting too few could appear snobbish. Every invitation was political theatre disguised as stationery, and the moment you accepted, the countdown began. You now entered the pre-ball phase, the weeks of worrying about outfits, practicing proper bows, avoiding scandal, and reminding your entire household that this event could determine your future happiness, your reputation, and whether certain relatives would ever stop bragging. So the invitation wasn't merely paper, it was pressure, it was hope. It was a politely worded summons to perform your best version of yourself under candlelight while pretending you weren't terrified. In the Georgian world, an invitation wasn't a request, it was destiny wrapped in calligraphy. Before a single guest stepped through the doors, before the orchestra tuned a single string, and long before anyone pretended to enjoy the fruit punch, an entire army of servants was already racing against the clock. Preparing a Georgian ballroom was a performance of its own, one that required sweat, skill, nerves of steel, and the ability to make a room look effortlessly elegant while ignoring the constant smell of hot wax and mild panic. Because nothing said luxury quite like a room sparkling with hundreds of candles, all of which threatened to set someone's decorative hairstyle on fire. The process began at dawn, not because the ballroom needed that much work, though it did, but because the staff needed that much time to mentally accept what awaited them. The ballroom itself was usually the grandest room in the house, designed with tall ceilings, reflective surfaces, and enough space for dozens of guests to glide, spin, gossip, and occasionally trip with dignity. Unfortunately, grandeur required maintenance, and maintenance required people who had been awake far too early. The first task was the floor. Georgian ballroom floors weren't just cleaned, they were polished to a level of shine that made them performance-ready and mildly hazardous. Servants rubbed them with beeswax until the wood gleamed like a mirror. The goal was to create a smooth surface for dancing, one that allowed guests to glide gracefully without sticking, squeaking, or catching on any imperfections. The downside? A floor that's smooth turned any misstep into a potential theatrical disaster. If you weren't careful, you might slide halfway across the room and accidentally propose marriage to a stranger by collision. But as long as the floor sparkled, the hosts were happy, guests were impressed, and servants prayed silently for everyone's ankles. Next came the monumental task of arranging the candles. Georgian balls required illumination, and illumination meant enough fire to scare a dragon. Chandeliers, wall sconces, candelabras, and even portable candle stands were hauled into place and carefully fitted with fresh tapers. Candles were expensive, so the number used in a ballroom was a direct measure of wealth, or recklessness. The lighting had to be bright enough to flatter guests, but not so bright that it revealed flaws, wrinkles, or questionable fashion choices. It was an extremely delicate balance, like giving everyone a flattering glow without burning the building down. Servants climbed tall ladders to position candles just right, hoping no one sneezed while they were 20 feet in the air. Once the candles were arranged, the mirrors became the next battlefield. Georgian ballrooms loved mirrors, not small, sensible ones, but giant, wall-sized reflections that multiplied the light, the crowd, and the possibility of realizing your wig was slightly crooked. Servants polished these mirrors until they reflected reality with cruel accuracy. Each one required careful cleaning, buffing, and wiping to remove fingerprints, smudges, or the ghost of last year's ball. A streak-free mirror was a triumph. A smudge was a declaration of household shame. The good news was that the mirror made the room look bigger. The bad news was that it also doubled the number of people witnessing your mistakes. Decorations were the next ordeal. While Georgian decor varied by region and wealth, the ballroom always transformed into a statement of prestige. Fresh greenery, floral arrangements, ribbons, gilded ornaments, and elaborate textile hangings turned the space into something that whispered luxury, while quietly screaming debt. Servants arranged every detail, strategically placed flowers to distract from architectural flaws, draped fabrics to soften harsh corners, and greenery chosen specifically to suggest freshness, even if it wilted 3 hours before guests arrived. Then came the acoustics. Georgian architecture loved echoing spaces, so musicians needed good placement. Chairs for the orchestra were set up carefully to balance sound, avoid drafts, and, most importantly, keep them far enough from guests that no one noticed when a violinist made a face during a difficult passage. Servants also checked the seating for chaperones, gossips, and anyone who needed a vantage point from which to supervise every young person within eyesight. But the silent hero of the entire preparation process was timing. Everything had to be completed before the first carriage rolled in. That meant coordinating dozens of tasks, waxing, dusting, arranging, lifting, polishing, fetching and fixing, while the household's upper members wandered in periodically to ask unhelpful questions like, does the room feel welcoming enough? Or, can we make the chandelier sparkle more? Or the dreaded, should we move everything 2 inches to the left? Meanwhile, the servants exchanged looks that said, please no, while actually saying, of course, madam. And beneath all this elegance lurked very real worry. One toppled candle could ruin the night. One slippery floor incident could spark gossip. One dusty mirror could taint the household's reputation for months. The stress level of preparing a Georgian ballroom sat somewhere between hosting royalty and juggling knives blindfolded. But when the last candle was lit, the last ribbon tied, and the floor shone like it had been buffed by angels with wax brushes, the room transformed. It was no longer a workspace. It was a stage, a glittering, shimmering world where guests would laugh, flirt, dance, judge, conspire, and maybe set their wig on fire. And none of them would ever know how many people nearly collapsed to make it happen. Before a Georgian guest even entered the ballroom, they first had to win the battle fought in front of their own mirror. Dressing for a Georgian ball wasn't simply about looking good, it was about surviving a fashion experience that actively worked against your body's natural desire to remain alive and functional. The good news: you look fabulous. The bad news: breathing is now optional. Because fashion in this era wasn't an accessory to the event, it was the event. If you weren't suffering for beauty, someone would politely question whether you were trying at all. The getting ready process began hours. Before the ball, sometimes even days, depending on how many decisions were involved. For women, preparation was practically a team sport. Hairdressers, dressmakers, maids, and the occasional neighbour, invited or not, all found their way into the room, armed with pins, powder, padding, and the kind of determination normally found in military commanders. The hairstyle alone could take the better half of an afternoon. Powdered hair was essential, preferably so white it suggested you'd just walked through a flour mill. Of course, the powder didn't just stay on your head. It coated the floor, the furniture, your clothing, and anyone who dared take a breath in your vicinity. Maids often emerged from the process looking like disgruntled ghosts. Then came the wigs, towering architectural masterpieces that required engineering degrees to assemble. Some rose high enough to be classified as small real estate. Others incorporated decorations, feathers, flowers, ribbons, ships, gardens, birds, and on rare occasions, something that might still be alive. Women risked hitting door frames, chandeliers, and any gentleman foolish enough to stand too close. Movements had to be slow, graceful, and extremely calculated, like balancing a porcelain teacup on your head while pretending it was completely natural. The wig was not merely hair, it was a declaration. I have arrived, and I hope this doesn't fall off before supper. But the true enemy of human comfort was the corset. If the wig stole your height, the corset stole your lung capacity. Georgian corsetry was a paradox. It helped create the fashionable shape, but only by declaring war on your ribs. Laced tight enough to rearrange internal organs, it demanded both commitment and the ability to inhale very, very strategically. Wearing one meant learning a new style of breathing, short, shallow, and always with the awareness that too deep a breath could cause you to briefly see other dimensions. Yet women bore it with dignity, because the silhouette it created was essential. A narrow waist, lifted posture, and the illusion that you weren't seconds away from passing out. Men were not exempt from suffering either. Though their fashion lacked the towering wigs, they compensated by wearing coats so tightly fitted that raising their arms above shoulder height became a physical impossibility. Their waistcoats were embroidered, colourful, and often outrageously expensive, designed to highlight a wealthy figure, and conceal the fact that they too were gasping gently for air under layers of fabric. And their stockings. Let's just say if a man had not spent at least 2 hours agonising over the shade of his silk hosiery, was he even Georgian? Footwear was its own battlefield. Women wore delicate shoes with small heels that provided almost no support. They were pretty, fashionable, and perfectly designed to betray you the moment the floor became even the slightest bit slippery. Men's shoes weren't much better, though they liked to pretend otherwise. Narrow, stiff, and often decorated with buckles heavy enough to tip a weaker man forward, they were ideal for walking into a room, and terrible for staying upright if you moved too quickly. Then came the clothing itself. Layers of fabric, petticoats, silk gowns, brocade coats, ruffled sleeves, lace cuffs, embroidered trims, and decorative elements whose only purpose was to catch on furniture or other guests. Georgian gowns demanded poise. They were wide, structured, and dramatic, giving the wearer a presence that could not be ignored. Unfortunately, they also transformed simple movements, like turning around, into logistical challenges requiring clear spatial awareness and possibly a support team. Dressing wasn't just about appearance, it was strategic. Every choice signalled status. The fabric announced wealth, the wig displayed boldness, the corset demonstrated discipline, shoes revealed taste, and accessories whispered ambition. Jewellery had to sparkle just enough to be enviable, but not so much that someone accused you of flaunting. Perfume was applied carefully, enough to smell pleasant, not enough to imply you were hiding something unfortunate. And above all, the ensemble had to survive several hours of dancing, sweating, social manoeuvring, and pretending all of this was comfortable. By the time a Georgian guest finally finished dressing, they were transformed, beautiful, glamorous, polished, slightly dizzy, and unable to bend at the waist without dislodging a structural element of their outfit. Every step required concentration. Every breath required permission from the corset. But as they looked in the mirror, shimmering under candlelight, they knew they had achieved the pinnacle of Georgian social preparation. They looked absolutely perfect, and only they knew the full extent of the suffering involved. Long before anyone began dancing or whispering behind fans, the Georgian ball had already begun. Outside, on the gravel, in the carriages lined up like anxious wooden ducks waiting their turn. The entrance was not simply the moment you walked into the ballroom. It was an entire ritual, a carefully orchestrated performance in which families attempted to appear composed, wealthy, elegant, and, most importantly, completely unbothered by the chaos happening around them. Arriving late wasn't fashionable. It was a survival tactic to avoid watching everyone else judge each other first. Because in Georgian society, the entrance wasn't just a step across a threshold. It was your opening sentence in a very long, very critical book everyone else was reading. Carriage congestion was the first battlefield. Dozens of vehicles arrived in clusters, wheels crunching against the driveway, horses snorting, footmen shouting directions that no one listened to, and drivers desperately trying not to crash into someone of higher status. If an earl's carriage got stuck behind a wealthy merchant's, the scandal practically wrote itself. Everyone pretended not to care about placement in line, but each family kept careful mental notes. Who arrived before them, who arrived after, and whether their carriage appeared sufficiently polished under the lantern light. Even the horses were expected to look dignified, though horses rarely cooperated. Once the carriage reached the front steps, the pressure intensified. Footmen had to leap down with the precision of acrobats, open the door in perfect synchronization, and create an elegant bridge between vehicle and entrance. Inside the carriage, guests sat frozen, pretending they hadn't just spent 20 minutes arguing about whether their wig was crooked, their coat too bright, or their corset too tight. The goal was to step out as though the journey had been nothing more than a pleasant breeze, despite the fact that most roads felt like travelling across a battlefield of potholes. The staircase was the next stage of the performance. Georgian hosts loved dramatic staircases, wide, sweeping architectural statements designed entirely for moments like this. Walking up these stairs required grace, poise, and the ability to pretend your shoes weren't plotting your demise. Gentlemen offered their hands to ladies, who in turn had to ascend step by step with the serene pace of someone who absolutely did not feel their gown trying to trip them. The staircase was where first impressions formed. Posture, smiles, elegance, and the delicate art of pretending you owned at least 5 more estates than you actually did. Meanwhile, families played a subtle game of wealth mimicry. Did you bring enough servants? Was your carriage glossy enough? Did your arrival time imply confidence rather than desperation? Even the pace of your walk suggested something. Too fast and you looked overeager. Too slow and you appeared uncertain. The ideal entrance required a pace that said, "I am magnificent and I know it," without drifting into "I'm magnificent and I may faint at any moment." Children were coached extensively on how to behave during this moment, instructed not to fidget, scratch, wave, sneeze, or show any indication of having emotions. Inside the entrance hall, the real power plays began. Guests were greeted by a receiving line, hosts standing in polished splendour, smiling warmly with the intensity of people who'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. Guests bowed, curtsied, and exchanged practiced pleasantries. The trick was to appear enthusiastic without appearing overly familiar. Too friendly, and you seemed desperate for attention. Too cool, and you risked insulting your hosts. It was a social tightrope, and everyone knew a single misplaced greeting could lead to a week's worth of gossip. Even the order in which guests entered the ballroom mattered. Higher-ranking families positioned themselves so they would be seen at the perfect moment when the lighting flattered there. Clothing in the crowd had grown just enough to provide an audience. Whether intentional or not, people timed their arrival to create maximum visual impact. Some guests lingered in the hall just long enough to make sure they entered at the precise moment when someone important was watching. Others delayed arriving altogether, waiting for whispers of who had already shown up. Arriving too early risked looking eager. Arriving too late risked looking like you were making a statement. And if there was one thing Georgian society loved, it was misinterpreting statements. Once inside the ballroom proper, the entrance became a slow-motion display of status. Guests paused just long enough for their clothing to catch the candlelight, for their hair to shimmer beneath the chandeliers, and for every observer to take in the full spectacle. People had entire strategies for where to stand during these opening moments. Near a mirror showed confidence. Near the musicians suggested refinement. Near the refreshment table implied hunger, and therefore weakness, unless executed with enough poise to appear deliberate. Every detail, every gesture, every breath contributed to the silent message, "I belong here." Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the Georgian entrance was how much effort went into appearing effortless. Families spent hours, or days, preparing for these 20 seconds of public display, and as soon as they were fully inside, the pressure didn't fade. It simply changed shape, transforming into the challenges of dancing, socializing, courting, gossiping, and avoiding humiliation under the watchful glow of 1,000 candles. But for that brief moment at the entrance, everyone existed in a world of grandeur, a world where elegance was everything, appearances were reality, and walking across a room felt like performing centre stage at a national play. A Georgian ballroom wasn't just a room, it was a statement carved into plaster and polished into wood. These grand architectural spaces were designed to impress, intimidate, and occasionally blind you with their shine. Every element, from the ceiling to the floor, served a purpose, not just aesthetic but social. In Georgian society, the ballroom announced who the hosts were, what they valued, and how much they were willing to spend to make sure everyone else knew it. Mirrors everywhere, because if you didn't know you were being watched, one of them would remind you. The first thing guests noticed was the height. Georgian ceilings didn't simply stretch upward, they soared. Ballrooms were intentionally built with lofty architecture to create the illusion of vastness, elegance, and endless air. High ceilings signalled wealth because they required more materials, more labour, and more heating resources than any rational person wanted to pay for. They also allowed heat from hundreds of candles to rise upward, so guests didn't immediately melt. Still, that didn't stop the occasional overheated wig from slipping in defiance of its architectural ambitions. Tall ceilings gave the room a grand atmosphere, but they also created echoes. Even the smallest cough sounded like a chorus of polite judgment rippling across the walls. Those echoes mattered. Acoustics were carefully studied long before ballrooms were built. Architects placed wood panelling, niches, decorative moulding, and structural curves to enhance or soften sound. Music had to travel cleanly across the room, and laughter, especially the flirtatious kind, needed to bounce off the walls in just the right way. Poor acoustics could ruin an evening. Too much echo and the orchestra sounded like it was performing inside a cavern. Too little echo and conversations became whispers, forcing guests to lean dangerously close to one another, which of course led to scandal, gossip, and at least one chaperone having a mild spiritual crisis. And then there were the mirrors. Georgian ballrooms adored mirrors the way modern influencers adore ring lights. Mirror placement was an art form, a careful strategy to magnify light, expand space, and remind everyone to sit up straighter. A single candle reflected across multiple gilded frames could make the entire room shimmer like a dream. But mirrors also served a very Georgian purpose: surveillance disguised as decoration. You could see who entered, who hovered by the refreshments, who danced with enthusiasm, and who danced with the enthusiasm of someone who deeply regretted their shoe choice. If you didn't know you were being watched, the room made sure you found out. Mirrors also helped amplify the wealth of the hosts. A ballroom lined with polished glass made the candlelight appear more abundant, the crowd appear larger, and the decorations appear more lavish. Every reflection was an echo of status, and every guest, willingly or not, became part of the display. It was impossible to hide in a Georgian ballroom. Even the corners gleamed with enough reflective surfaces to catch the slightest movement. Guests walked differently because of those mirrors. They lifted their chins, straightened their spines, and attempted to look engaged even while plotting to escape to a cooler hallway. The walls beneath the mirrors were adorned with detailed plasterwork, swags, scrolls, garlands, and flourishes curling in elegant designs that required hours of craftsmanship. This decoration wasn't just ornamental. It defined the character of the room. Smooth curves softened the sound and framed the mirrors, while delicate motifs framed the overall aesthetic. Refined, graceful, and unmistakably expensive. The moulding flowed across the walls in rhythmic patterns that gave the room a visual harmony, guiding the eye towards central points, chandeliers, doors, or occasionally an impressive aristocrat trying very hard to appear natural. Speaking of chandeliers, these glittering masterpieces dominated the ceiling. Hanging high enough to avoid assaulting taller wigs, chandeliers were architectural jewellery. Crystals, metalwork, and candles arranged in radiant tiers. They were built to capture and scatter light in every direction, adding sparkle to gowns, hair, and faces. But chandeliers also added tension. Every guest who walked beneath one had a fleeting thought. What if this thing falls? It rarely did, but Georgian ballrooms were all about beauty mixed with mild existential dread. The layout of the room, the geometry, was equally intentional. Ballrooms tended to be long rectangles or spacious ovals, shapes ideal for facilitating movement. Dancers could glide, processions could form, and observers could station themselves along the edges with maximum visibility. Furniture was minimal, usually pushed against the walls so the centre remained an open stage. Seating along the sides created natural layers of hierarchy. The most important guests claimed prime viewing spots, while others remained standing and pretended not to mind. The floor completed the architectural experience. Smooth, polished wood, often laid in a geometric parquet pattern, created the perfect surface for dancing. Its gleam was part artistry, part functionality, and part environmental hazard. The floor reflected the candlelight softly, adding to the room's glow, but was just slick enough to demand good balance and a prayer. Its craftsmanship was a point of pride. No cracks, no gaps, no uneven boards. A ballroom floor needed to be as flawless as the reputation of the family that owned it. Every architectural choice contributed to a social ecosystem. Height encouraged grandeur. Mirrors encouraged self-awareness. Acoustics encouraged conversation. Lighting encouraged admiration. And the open central space encouraged performance. The ballroom wasn't simply a backdrop. It shaped the way people behaved, how they moved, how they interacted, and how they understood themselves within the hierarchy of the evening. Georgian architecture understood something essential. People didn't just come to a ball to dance. They came to be seen, evaluated, and remembered. And the room itself made sure that happened. Gleaming, echoing, towering over the guests like a shimmery, elegant reminder that society was always watching. If Georgian ballrooms had one true magician, it wasn't the dance master, the musicians, or even the aristocrats pretending their shoes didn't hurt. It was the lighting. More specifically, the candles. Hundreds of them. Sometimes thousands. A glowing army of wax and flame engineered to transform every guest into a slightly better version of themselves. Think of it as the original Instagram filter, except it could burn your wig off. Candlelight wasn't simply about illumination. It was about manipulation. Hosts understood that beauty, wealth, and charm could all be enhanced with the right lighting. A badly placed candle could age someone 10 years. A well-placed candle could make a tired face look dreamy, mysterious, and capable of securing a very advantageous marriage. Lighting was the silent puppeteer of social success. The first trick lay in the type of candle used. Beeswax candles, the luxury model of the 18th century, burned with a clean, bright flame and emitted a faintly sweet scent. They didn't smoke or sputter, which made them crucial for maintaining flattering light. Poorer households used tallow candles, which produced more smoke and a somewhat questionable odour, but no respectable ballroom would allow anything that made guests wrinkle their noses unless it was someone's cologne. Beeswax candles were expensive, so lighting a ballroom with them wasn't just atmospheric, it was a public declaration of wealth, a fragrant glowing flex. Strategic placement was where the real artistry began. Candlelight falls softly, creating gentle shadows that could hide imperfections if angled correctly. The goal was to illuminate the room while avoiding direct overhead lighting that might expose tired eyes, blemishes, or the emotional suffering caused by corset compression. Servants weren't merely setting out candles, they were crafting a visual experience, positioning flames to flatter every cheekbone within reach. Mirrors played an essential role in this illusion. They multiplied the candles, bouncing light across the room in warm ripples that softened hard lines and gave skin a dewy glow. Even someone who had spent the entire day powdering, squeezing and adjusting their appearance would find that candlelit mirrors made them look, if not perfect, then at least pleasantly blurred. Candlelight was forgiving. Mirrors were flattering. The combination was powerful enough to make a chaperone consider lowering her fan for once. But the real genius lay in angle engineering. Candles placed at eye level created sharp reflections that lit up the face, highlighting youth and vitality. Candles placed slightly below eye level cast upward illumination that softened jawlines and brightened complexions. Candles placed behind decorative screens created a dreamy diffusion that made everyone look as if they'd stepped out of a romantic portrait. Georgian lighting was less about brightness and more about temperature, tone and mood. It aimed to make guests look appealing, approachable, and hopefully unaware of how much work went into their temporary glow. Hosts used lighting to shape social behaviour as well. Dimmer corners became zones of whispered gossip, subtle flirting, and chaperone panic. Brighter areas encouraged conversation and display, perfect for announcing one's presence or subtly showing off a new gown. Candle clusters near musicians ensured the orchestra appeared elegant, even if half the players were squinting at their sheet music. Soft lighting around seating areas made tired guests look serene instead of exhausted. Every zone of the ballroom had a purpose, and the candles were its guiding force. Even staircases received special lighting treatment. Candles placed at intervals created an enchanting ascent into the ballroom, guiding guests upward like luminous breadcrumbs toward the world of social expectation. Shadows danced along the walls, making everything feel grander, more mysterious, and slightly more hazardous. Walking up a staircase while trying to avoid stepping on your own gown was one challenge. Doing it beside open flames was another entirely. Candlelight also played defence. A clever host could use it to conceal cracks in plasterwork, fading wallpaper, or that one corner of the room still recovering from last season's disastrous floral arrangement. Shadows could mask architectural flaws or distract from patches where the paint hadn't dried evenly. Candlelight not only beautified the guests, it beautified the building itself. Yet, as magical as candlelight was, it carried a very real danger. One wrong move, one overly enthusiastic dancer, or one wig leaning too close to a flame could result in spectacular chaos. Servants patrolled the perimeter like silent firefighters, ready to snuff out any candle that flickered suspiciously close to human hair. Guests were warned, subtly of course, to avoid leaning against candelabras. Some even practiced a specific ballroom posture designed to keep them upright, elegant, and far from anything combustible. Despite the risks, the end result was worth it. The ballroom glowed with a warmth unmatched by modern lighting. Faces looked kinder, eyes brighter, clothing richer. People appeared polished, poised, and a touch more glamorous than they felt. Candlelight softened arguments, sweetened flirtations, and turned even the most ordinary guest into someone who, at least for the evening, looked like they belonged in a portrait hanging above a mantel. For a few shining hours, imperfections blurred away. Wrinkles softened, dimples deepened, colours warmed, and the ballroom transformed into a world suspended between reality and illusion. Candlelight was not merely illumination, it was transformation, seduction, and artistry rolled into one dangerously flammable package. Before a single dance step was taken, before the musicians lifted their bows, the ballroom had already divided itself into invisible layers of power. Georgian society didn't need posted rules or signs. Everyone instinctively knew where they belonged, where they didn't belong, and the social consequences of pretending not to know the difference. The good news? You're allowed inside. The bad news? You might still be socially invisible. This hierarchy wasn't printed on the invitations, but it was as real as the polished parquet floor. Titles, lineage, wealth, reputation, social influence, marriage prospects, and even distant family connections determined how favourably or unfavourably you were viewed. The ballroom was less a neutral gathering place, and more a glittering battlefield where everyone carried silent badges of status. At the top were the aristocrats, with ancient titles and ancestral estates. They drifted into the ballroom with the serene confidence of people who had never in their lives been forced to stand near a draughty window. These were dukes, duchesses, earls, viscounts, and baronets who had inherited not only land and wealth, but a social aura that practically glowed around them. They were the gravitational centres of the room. Where they stood, others formed orbits. Below them, and sometimes nervously beside them, stood the wealthy elite. These were merchants, financiers, or rising families whose fortunes were built on commerce rather than centuries of lineage. They had the money, but not always the pedigree, which meant they walked a tightrope between admiration and suspicion. The aristocracy relied on their wealth, but never admitted it out loud. Meanwhile, the wealthy relied on the aristocracy's approval, hoping their children might eventually marry into prestige rather than waiting for it to materialize. Next came the genteel but not wealthy, the families with respectable names and impeccable manners, but wallets that had grown sadly thin. Their survival depended on maintaining appearances, well-tailored clothing that hid strategic mending, a carriage hired rather than owned, jewellery borrowed from generous relatives, and the ability to speak confidently about landscapes on their estate, without mentioning that estate consisted of a garden and 3 chickens. They mingled carefully, relying on charm and polished behaviour to compensate for the lack of coin. Below them were newcomers, travellers, or connections of connections who managed to secure invitations through social manoeuvring. They stood a bit awkwardly near the edges at first, testing whether anyone recognised their names or pretended to. They were not unwelcome. Ballrooms thrived on novelty, but they were carefully observed until they proved themselves capable of conversation without embarrassing anyone. Reputation was a currency all its own. A single rumour could alter your position faster than any candle could flicker. A gentleman known for generosity, wit, or decisive dancing might rise swiftly in favour. A lady renowned for grace, intelligence, or excellent hostess skills could find herself surrounded by admirers. But a hint of scandal, real or imagined, could isolate someone so thoroughly that even the mirrors seemed to ignore them. Those at risk of reputation damage often placed themselves strategically near respected figures, as if proximity alone could lend them borrowed stability. Even movement through the room reflected hierarchy. The most important guests occupied the warm, well-lit centre of the ballroom, where their presence could be admired by all. Those with middling status hovered between centre and side, drifting from group to group like polite social satellites. The uncertain or unestablished stood at the edges, pretending they were merely enjoying the view. They practised their posture, rehearsed small talk, and waited for someone of higher standing to acknowledge them so they could step into the social current. Seating was another silent indicator. Chairs along the walls were not simply places to rest. They were arranged in an unofficial ranking system. Older, higher-ranking figures claimed the most comfortable seats with the best vantage points. They observed, commented, and occasionally judged. Younger, guests or those without strong social anchors remained standing, hoping to be invited to join a conversation before their feet surrendered. Even dance invitations followed strict rules. Partners were chosen with strategic care. A dance with a highly ranked guest elevated your visibility. A dance with someone less ranked could signal kindness or desperation, depending on the observer. Declining a dance required finesse, as rejecting the wrong person could create offence. Accepting the wrong person could imply an unwanted level of familiarity. Every choice echoed across the room through glances, whispers, and raised fans. Hierarchy even extended to the refreshment tables. Important guests approached with ease, trusting that punch and pastries would not run out. Others approached cautiously, only daring to grab a plate if someone more significant had already taken the same pastry. Heaven forbid you became known as the guest who reached for the lemon tart uninvited, social suicide. And yet, despite its rigidity, the hierarchy was not static. A brilliant joke, a graceful dance, a charming comment at the right moment could shift perceptions ever so slightly. One evening in the ballroom could elevate or diminish a person's social standing. Georgian society loved the delicate balance of status, stable enough to be understood, flexible enough to remain exciting. The ballroom wasn't merely a place to socialize, it was a theatre, and everyone was both actor and audience. For many guests, the evening's challenge was not just being seen, it was being seen correctly. Their smiles, gestures, and conversations were calculated to fit the space they occupied. They lived in a world where standing a few feet closer to the wrong person could shift how others interpreted your entire existence. In the Georgian ballroom, hierarchy wasn't a rule, it was an instinct. Everyone felt it, everyone followed it, and everyone tried in small ways to rise above it. And all the while, the mirrors watched. Long before a Georgian guest glided across the ballroom floor with the illusion of natural grace, they had already survived something far more harrowing: the dance master. These were the stern, brilliant, and occasionally terrifying figures whose job was to take ordinary humans, people with clumsy legs, questionable rhythm, and a natural tendency to trip over invisible obstacles, and transform them into dancers fit for society's most demanding stage. If your toes weren't bleeding, the dance master assumed you weren't trying. A dance master was far more than a tutor. They were an architect of elegance, a guardian of posture, a commander of rhythm, and a silent enforcer of social propriety. Their influence stretched far beyond the dance floor. To dance well was to navigate society well. To falter was to risk public humiliation. A dance master knew this, and they wielded that knowledge like a conductor's baton. Precisely, dramatically, and, often with flamboyant flair. Training began early, sometimes in childhood. Families hired dance masters to visit their homes once or twice a week, each lesson a carefully choreographed blend of stern corrections and reluctant encouragement. The master arrived armed with a cane, a portable violin if they were particularly talented, and a sense of self-importance so powerful it could be felt 3 rooms away. Students stood straight the moment they heard footsteps approaching. No one dared slouch in a dance master's presence. These instructors could detect improper posture, the way a hawk detects movement in a field. Their first lesson? Posture. Shoulders down, spine long, chin level, arms relaxed but not floppy, legs ready but not rigid. It was like learning to exist as both a marble statue and a graceful bird at the same time. Students were reminded that their bodies were not to move like normal humans. Every gesture required precision. Every step required awareness. Even breathing was something the master adjusted. Too loud, too shallow, too uncertain. Dance masters believed elegance came from discipline, and discipline came from constant correction. Next came rhythm. Dance masters tapped feet, clapped hands, and occasionally struck their cane on the floor with alarming force to emphasize the beat. Georgian dances were intricate and social. One misstep could send an entire line crashing into chaos. Masters drilled timing relentlessly. If a student stepped too quickly, the master stopped the music. If they stepped too slowly, the master sighed theatrically, as though civilization itself had been betrayed. Patterns and formations were memorized through repetition. Students practiced the minuet, cotillion, allemande, and country dances until the footwork became instinct. Partners switched, lines reformed, hands touched lightly, always lightly, and transitions flowed like water. The dance master's pride depended on the student's ability to perform these figures gracefully in front of an audience who was ready to dissect every movement with polite but merciless scrutiny. But it wasn't only about the steps. Dance masters taught expression. A dancer's face had to convey controlled delight. Not too happy, not too serious. Too much enthusiasm made one look overeager. Too little, and one appeared bored or rude. Masters instructed students on how to smile without wrinkling their cheeks, how to bow without wobbling, and how to show interest without giving scandalous signals. Even the flick of a wrist or tilt of a head required guidance. Their tempers could be legendary. A dance master witnessing sloppy footwork was like a poet watching someone set fire to his manuscripts. They paced, corrected, lectured, demonstrated, sighed dramatically, and occasionally muttered prayers for patience. But beneath their intensity lay a fierce devotion to their craft. They weren't strict because they enjoyed suffering. Well, maybe a little. They were strict because the ballroom was merciless. A poorly executed dance wasn't merely embarrassing, it was social exposure on a grand scale. Masters also had reputations to maintain. A student who danced flawlessly gave glory to the instructor. A student who danced awkwardly reflected poorly on the teacher. So the pressure flowed both ways. Masters worked tirelessly to polish every student into a presentable performer. Parents demanded results. Students demanded survival. The dance master demanded perfection. Despite their sternness, many students developed a strange admiration for their instructors. Dance masters could be charismatic, witty, and deeply skilled. Their movements were mesmerizing, fluid, controlled, impossibly graceful. Watching a master demonstrate a sequence was like watching poetry come alive. And when a student finally performed a dance correctly, the master's rare nod of approval felt like receiving a Medal of Honor. On the night of the ball, the influence of the dance master lingered. As guests took their places on the dance floor, they heard the ghost of their instructor's voice correcting their steps, straightening their shoulders, and urging them not to embarrass the entire household. Every smooth turn and elegant bow was a tribute to hours of disciplined training. And every graceful crossing of the floor was a victory over the clumsy realities of everyday life. In a sense, Georgian dance masters were sculptors, shaping the bodies and social futures of their students. The illusion of effortless elegance in the ballroom was not born spontaneously. It was crafted through sweat, repetition, and the unwavering belief that anyone with enough correction could glide across the floor like nobility. Before anyone could glide, step, bow, twirl, or narrowly avoid stepping on someone else's silk slippers, the ballroom needed music, and Georgian music was an experience all its own. To a modern listener, it might seem like cheerful classical melodies. To those inside the ballroom, it was the heartbeat of the night, a lively pulse that guided every foot, every gesture, and every near miss. Georgian dances weren't about romance, they were about not colliding with 17 different elbows. At the heart of every ball was the orchestra. Not a massive symphonic machine, but a small, carefully selected ensemble perched on a raised gallery or tucked along one side of the room. Violins formed the backbone of the group, joined by cellos, flutes, bassoons, and sometimes oboes or horns if the host had money, or ambition, to spare. Harpsichords often provided rhythm and structure, tapping out the tempo with crisp, unmistakable clarity. The musicians were highly trained but chronically underappreciated, expected to play for hours with minimal breaks and maximum energy, while maintaining flawless synchronization. Orchestras at balls required discipline. The dancers depended entirely on their ability to keep tempo consistent. A single slip in timing could throw an entire set of dancers into chaos, transforming a graceful line into a bewildered clump of confused aristocrats. And no musician wanted to be responsible for Lady Wexford's scandalous stumble or Mr. Farnsworth's dramatic fall, both of which would be discussed for months. The music chosen for a ball varied depending on the dances of the evening. Georgian society adored structured, pattern-based dances that combined elegance with mild aerobic exertion. Popular favourites included the minuet, which required poise and precision, the allemande, which involved graceful partner movements, and country dances, which were lively, communal, and slightly chaotic if participants lacked coordination. These dances were social puzzles set to music, figures forming and dissolving like shifting constellations, all guided by the orchestra's melody and rhythm. The minuet stood as the crown jewel of Georgian dance music. Slow, refined, and deeply symbolic, it was often the first dance of the evening. The minuet demanded a strong musical backbone, delicate yet commanding. Violins carried the melody, while cellos created a gentle undercurrent. Each bowstroke guided dancers through their carefully rehearsed movements. A well-played minuet was serene. A poorly played one was a nightmare of awkward pauses and mistimed steps. Country dances, on the other hand, were the life of the party. Their music was lively, energetic, and designed to encourage interaction. These dances involved long lines of couples weaving in and out, crossing paths, switching partners, and praying to all known deities that no one tripped. The music was fast-paced and repetitive enough to keep dancers in sync, but varied enough to keep the room lively. Flutes trilled overhead, fiddles raced joyfully through the melody, and the harpsichord held everything together like a strict chaperone, making sure no one misbehaved. The orchestra had to match the dancers' energy. Faster tempos created excitement, but risked disaster if the dancers weren't prepared. Slower tempos made the movements elegant but could sap the room of vibrancy. Musicians listened to the atmosphere as carefully as they listened to each other. If the dancers seemed confident, the tempo lifted. If too many people began gasping for air, the musicians politely eased their pace. Music controlled the night, but it also responded to it. Instrument choice mattered as well. Violins brought brightness and clarity, their notes slicing through the hum of conversation and rustle of silk. Cellos grounded the sound with warm, steady tones that kept dancers anchored. Flutes added airiness, ideal for lifts, spins, or moments of flirtation. Bassoons brought humour and richness, especially useful in dances where the musicians knew half the participants were operating on fumes and determination alone. And horns, loud, bold, and dramatic, were used sparingly, often to mark transitions or to remind guests that, yes, even the orchestra had flair. The acoustics of the ballroom shaped the sound as much as the instruments. High ceilings created natural resonance, allowing the music to swell and linger. Polished floors reflected more than just candlelight, they reflected sound, brightening the orchestra's presence. Mirrors added additional shimmer, bouncing melodies in unpredictable ways. Guests often experienced a symphony of reflections, a musical hologram that filled the room with warmth and motion. Yet the music also had a hidden role. It served as a silent communication system. A shift in tempo signalled the end of one dance and the beginning of another. A particular tune might indicate a dance for couples, prompting chaperones to suddenly grow alert. When the orchestra launched into a familiar melody, dancers perked up, either with excitement or with dread, depending on how complex the upcoming steps were. In the midst of all this, musicians remained stoic. They watched dancers carefully, adjusting dynamics and volume to accommodate the room's chaos. Their job was to make the dancers look good, which meant smoothing over mistakes with grace. If a dancer missed a beat, the orchestra kept steady, offering a musical hand to pull them back in. If a couple fell behind, the musicians resisted the urge to slow down. The music could not be compromised, even for the clumsiest guest. Music shaped the social world of the ballroom. A lively tune lifted spirits and encouraged daring conversation. A gentle melody softened the mood, creating spaces where flirtation blossomed. A dramatic crescendo could turn a simple figure into a moment of triumph. Every note played that night carried meaning, emotion, and opportunity. And so the Georgian ballroom pulsed with life. Not just from those dancing or whispering or watching, but from the orchestra that powered every movement. Their music filled the air, weaving the crowd together in a tapestry of rhythm and elegance. Once the music began, and the orchestra lifted the room into motion, the ballroom transformed into a stage where every guest, willingly or unwillingly, performed. Dancing was not simply entertainment, it was a social examination conducted in full view of every watchful eye, every judgmental whisper, and every chaperone who believed her life's calling was to detect impropriety from 40 feet away. The good news? You found a partner. The bad news? So did their entire family who is now watching. At its core, Georgian dancing was a test of poise. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture symbolic. You didn't simply step forward, you glided. You didn't just turn, you pivoted with elegance, as though gravity itself had agreed to cooperate. And you didn't merely touch your partner, you offered your hand like a delicate diplomatic agreement, one that could be revoked instantly if someone made the wrong impression. Partnering was the first challenge. The moment a dance began, gentlemen scanned the room for suitable partners while ladies attempted to look pleasantly available but not desperate. A gentleman's approach had to be respectful, confident, and timed with care. Too early, and he seemed overeager. Too late, and he might find himself stuck dancing with his cousin, or worse, forced to sit out entirely, an unspoken admission of social failure. A lady, upon receiving an invitation, offered a curtsy that communicated graceful acceptance, mild enthusiasm, or resignation, depending on whether she liked the gentleman in question. Couples paired off in neat arrangements, each partnership silently observed by the entire room. The moment they stepped onto the dance floor, the performance began. Lines formed, partners aligned, and dancers awaited the musical cue with the seriousness of soldiers preparing for battle. The first steps were critical. A stumble in the opening sequence could define a dancer's reputation for the rest of the evening. And make no mistake, people noticed. A single misstep could be forgiven. 2 missteps became gossip. 3 missteps turned into a family legend retold at dinners for the next decade. Dancing required awareness of space, of rhythm, and of everyone else's limbs. Georgian dances often involved weaving patterns, switching partners, and moving in synchronized formations. This meant avoiding collisions was an essential skill. You needed sharp reflexes to dodge the enthusiastic gentleman whose shoes were slightly too slippery, or the lady whose skirt width threatened to knock half the line off the course. Georgian dancing wasn't about romance. They saved that for novels. It was about staying upright while 20 pairs of heels stamped dangerously close to your toes. Etiquette made everything more complicated. You couldn't simply dance well. You had to dance correctly. Eye contact needed to be warm but brief. Smiles had to appear natural but not suggestive. Hand touches were light, meaningful, and absolutely free of anything that could make a chaperone's eyebrows shoot into orbit. Bending too deeply was improper. Not bending enough was rude. And stepping outside the prescribed path? Social catastrophe. Even the distance between partners was regulated. Too close, and you risked scandal. Too far, and you looked stiff or uninterested. The ideal spacing was just enough to suggest refinement, but not enough to let a draft slip between you. Social rules nested inside the dance steps, creating a network of expectations that everyone tried desperately to remember, while also keeping up with the music. But behind the controlled elegance, the dance floor shimmered with unspoken drama. Flirty glances darted across the room like soft sparks. A held gaze across a passing moment could ignite speculation, hope, or panic. A gentleman might linger a heartbeat too long as he handed off a partner. A lady might tilt her head just slightly to signal interest, or to avoid the candle smoke drifting into her eyes. These moments didn't go unnoticed. Chaperones circled like hawks, their fans fluttering with sharp suspicion. Triumphs happened too, a perfectly executed sequence, smooth turns, well-timed steps, a poised demeanour earned admiration. Some dancers glowed with effortless grace, leaving the room murmuring with approval. These were the stars of the ballroom, the people others tried to imitate. They knew the patterns intimately, anticipated shifts in tempo, and glided with an ease that made the whole room feel more polished. Yet for every triumph, humiliation lurked nearby. A gentleman stepping on his partner's gown could unravel hours of preparation. A lady losing her balance might tumble into the person behind her, setting off a chain reaction of awkward bows, and heaven forbid a dancer forget the next figure. Suddenly the elegant formation dissolved into confusion as everyone attempted to pretend nothing was wrong. The orchestra kept playing, unbothered, as dancers frantically corrected themselves. Still, each dance ended in a ritual of politeness. Partners bowed and curtsied, offering compliments through strained smiles. Even if the dance had been a battlefield of near disasters, etiquette demanded a pleasant farewell. Once released, dancers drifted off the floor, some flushed with pride, others trembling with relief, and a few already plotting how to redeem themselves in the next set. The dance floor was never just a dance floor. It was a crucible of social opportunity. Friendships strengthened, rivalries sharpened, romances hinted at, futures imagined. Every step carried weight. Every figure told a story, and every dancer, no matter how nervous, played their part. In the Georgian ballroom, no one simply flirted. Heaven forbid anyone be that straightforward. Instead, romantic interest unfolded like a silent theatrical performance, one built on glances, gestures, subtle movements, and the ever-mysterious fan. Everything meant something, yet nothing meant what you thought it meant. If someone dropped their fan, it meant everything or nothing. Interpretation sold separately. Courtship was a delicate art in this world of mirrors and candlelight. Direct conversation between unmarried men and women was tightly regulated, and any expression of interest had to be restrained, dignified, and deniable. So the ballroom evolved a secret language, unofficial but universally understood, that allowed couples to communicate beneath the radar of chaperones who patrolled with the intensity of trained border guards. The eyes were the first and most powerful tools. A single glance could convey curiosity, admiration, caution, or scandalous interest depending on its duration and timing. Too brief, and the message was lost. Too long, and the onlookers began to whisper. A well-timed look across a set of dancers felt like an electric spark, a promise that the next dance or conversation might hold something more. These glances created a rhythm of their own, echoing the music but carrying a far more private melody. Fans, though, were the true instruments of courtship. A lady's fan was not merely a tool for cooling. It was a coded device, capable of sending entire paragraphs of meaning without uttering a single word. Opening a fan slowly could hint at interest. Snapping it shut too quickly suggested displeasure. Fanning rapidly indicated nerves or excitement, or the unfortunate position of standing too close to someone wearing overly enthusiastic cologne. Holding the fan near the heart might convey affection. Holding it near the face suggested flirtation, and dropping it, well, that depended on who you asked. For some, a dropped fan was an invitation. For others, it was a cry for help. For the chaperone watching, it was a sign she needed to move closer. Hand gestures also carried layers of meaning. A lady adjusting her glove could signal awareness of a gentleman's presence. A gentleman smoothing his coat might subtly draw attention to himself. Even the simple act of offering a hand for balance during a turn could linger with meaning, provided the chaperone didn't narrow her eyes suspiciously. Everything in the ballroom was exaggerated by context. A touch that lasted half a second longer than necessary could spark a week of speculation. Conversations flirted too, though very carefully. Words had to be polite, refined, and proportional to the dancer's social standing. No one risked saying anything too forward. Chaperones listened with an enthusiasm that bordered on competitive sport. Instead, flirtation hid within compliments about dancing ability, comments about the music, or inquiries into one's enjoyment of the evening. A compliment on someone's posture could be shockingly bold. A comment about the warmth of the room might be a coded invitation to walk near an open window where supervision was lighter. But genuine interest required bravery. Couples seeking a moment of privacy had to navigate a labyrinth of social expectations. They might drift toward the edges of the ballroom, hoping to speak without interruption. They might linger near a window alcove, pretending to admire the view while exchanging hurried whispers. Or they might take advantage of the brief moments during dance transitions when partners switched or reformed lines. These tiny pockets of time, mere seconds, allowed for glimpses of real emotion. A quickly murmured compliment, a shared laugh, a question answered in a whisper. Each moment felt stolen, fragile and thrilling. Chaperones, of course, were not fooled. They stationed themselves with military precision, their eyes scanning for any suspicious proximity. They understood the coded behaviours better than anyone else. They had once used them themselves. A chaperone could intercept a budding romance with the efficiency of a hawk snatching prey mid-flight. Her raised eyebrow alone could ruin an entire evening's flirtation strategy. Still, the coded dance persisted. Courtship in the Georgian ballroom was not about grand declarations but subtle strategies. A lady might arrange to be in a particular part of the room at a particular time, hoping a certain gentleman would pass by. A gentleman might position himself in a group conversation so he could be seen, or so he could see someone. Entire romances blossomed through nothing more than exchanged glances and whispered compliments over the course of several balls. Whether these romances amounted to anything depended on countless factors: family approval, social expectations, financial concerns, and the occasional unpredictable choice of the heart. Yet for all its complexity, the game had a magic of its own. The coded flirtation created a world where anticipation mattered more than action, where the thrill lay not in bold declarations but in hidden meanings, where the smallest touch could make someone's pulse race. Romance was woven into the very structure of the ballroom. It shimmered through the candlelight, echoed in the music, and danced quietly between the guests. For some, the ballroom was the closest they would come to expressing their true desires. For others, it was the place where everything began. Either way, courtship wasn't simply part of the ball, it was the secret heartbeat beneath all the glitter and grace. In the Georgian ballroom, the most powerful object wasn't the chandeliers, the mirror-lined walls, or even the mountains of pastries waiting by the refreshment table. It was far smaller, far lighter, and far more dangerous. The dance card. A delicate booklet of paper, ribbon-bound and deceptively innocent-looking, yet capable of shaping alliances, igniting rivalries, and sealing marital futures. Your dance card wasn't paper. It was a battlefield with ink. Every lady received a dance card upon entering the ballroom, or brought her own, adorned with lace or embossed with her initials. Inside, neatly printed or handwritten, were the dances scheduled for the evening. Minuets, allemande sets, country dances, reels, cotillions. Each line awaited a name, and each name held unimaginable political weight. This wasn't merely a list of partners. It was a record of favour, opportunity, and whisper-worthy intrigue. The moment the cards appeared, the rush began. Gentlemen approached with poised confidence, or hopeful dread, hoping to secure coveted dances. The first few entries on a lady's card mattered immensely. They signalled her standing, her desirability, her social connections, and whether she had come tonight to politely mingle or to wage matrimonial warfare. A minuet early in the evening was especially prestigious, so the gentleman who claimed that spot had both opportunity and responsibility. If he danced beautifully, he secured admiration. If he danced poorly, he risked being remembered for the wrong reason. Dance cards required strategy. A lady needed to balance her choices carefully. Accept too many invitations from a single gentleman, and tongues wagged. Accept none, and she appeared aloof or unfriendly. Turn down the wrong person too abruptly, and she risked offending a family whose friendship mattered. Say yes too quickly, and she seemed overeager. Every name written down was a decision, one made in seconds but discussed for days. Gentlemen, meanwhile, navigated their own labyrinth. Being too aggressive in filling a lady's card suggested desperation. Being too slow left them falling back on partners they had not intended to pursue. Many gentlemen prepared conversational manoeuvres to approach specific ladies at precisely the right moment. Not too early to look over-eager, not too late to seem forgetful. Timing was everything. Arrive one moment too soon and she wasn't ready. Arrive one moment too late, and your preferred line was already filled by your rival, who would then smile politely over her shoulder as if he hadn't just stolen your evening. Then there were the unspoken rules surrounding refusals. A lady could decline a dance, of course, but she had to do it with impeccable courtesy, and an excuse so graceful that even the rejected gentleman felt it was reasonable. However, if she declined a dance and then accepted the same dance with someone else moments later, society took note. That wasn't a minor slight. It was a declaration of hierarchy, preference, and sometimes open hostility. Dance cards recorded these slights permanently. Tiny paper memorials of social battles fought behind fans and polite smiles. A full dance card was a sign of social success, but it could also be a trap. Once all the lines were filled, a lady had no room for spontaneous opportunities. If a highly desirable partner approached too late, she could only look regretfully at her already completed card. Occasionally, this led to cancellations, a diplomatic nightmare. Breaking a dance appointment required finesse, delicate explanation, and the hope that the original partner was either forgiving or too oblivious to realise what had happened. Dance cards also served as subtle matchmaking tools. Mothers watched which names appeared repeatedly. Fathers calculated which families were represented. Chaperones observed the tone of each interaction. A dance card could reveal far more about potential courtships than the dancers realised. For young women entering society, the patterns formed on their cards, who asked first, who asked often, who asked boldly, were studied with academic intensity over breakfast the next morning. Rivalries flourished around dance cards. If two ladies found themselves vying for the same gentleman's attention, the entries on their cards became their battlegrounds. One might proudly announce she had secured the supper dance with him, an extended, intimate interlude. The other might counter with the fact that she had the opening minuet. Tension simmered beneath the lace and ribbons. Even the gentlemen were not immune. Seeing another man's name in the coveted centre slot of a lady's card could sting with surprising intensity. Despite the competition, dance cards also brought joy. They created anticipation, a sense of excitement that built as the evening progressed. A lady might glance at her card between dances counting down the moments until a partner she particularly admired would take her hand. A gentleman might check the schedule to rehearse the steps mentally before the big moment. Dance cards held tiny stories, hopes, disappointments, surprises, victories. As the night progressed, the card became a record of movement. Names fluttered across the paper like footprints. The ink smudged slightly as the hands grew warm. Ribbons frayed from being held too tightly during exciting dances. Some guests saved their cards afterward, tucking them away in drawers as souvenirs. Others tore them apart in frustration after a disappointing evening. But every dance card, filled, half-used, or curiously empty, told the truth of the night. By the end of the event, the card revealed more than just a sequence of dances. It revealed alliances quietly forming, affections cautiously blooming, grudges lingering, and reputations evolving. It was the silent diary of the ballroom, recording the social choreography unfolding between the steps. While the ballroom dazzled with candlelight, music, and carefully curated elegance, another battlefield lurked quietly against the walls, the refreshment tables. Here, beneath towering displays of fruit and elaborately folded napkins, lay the greatest gamble of the evening. Because Georgian ballroom food didn't nourish you, it tested you. At first glance, the refreshment spread appeared divine. A gleaming punch bowl sparkled invitingly beneath chandeliers, surrounded by delicate pastries arranged with mathematical precision. Fresh fruit was stacked into improbable pyramids, defying gravity and common sense. Platters of sweets glowed with sugar, while trays of savoury bites promised both delight and digestive uncertainty. Everything was arranged to impress the eye, if not necessarily to please the stomach. The centrepiece of any refreshment table was the punch bowl, a vast, swirling ocean of mystery. Georgian punch was a concoction of spirits, citrus, spices, and occasionally ingredients that should have stayed far away from beverages. Recipes varied wildly. Some punches were sweet and pleasant, others were fiery enough to dissolve emotional restraint, and a few were strong enough to make guests consider lying down immediately. Hosts took pride in their punch, guarding recipes like military secrets passed down through dramatic family tradition. A sip could bring warmth and courage, or regret and confusion. No two bowls ever tasted the same, and guests approached them with cautious optimism. Beside the punch lay an army of pastries. Tiny tarts, sugared buns, custard-filled delights, and dainty cakes topped with icing that shone like lacquered jewels. These were meant to be eaten delicately, with the barest touch of the fingertips, which was difficult when the pastries were either too crumbly or too sticky to behave. Guests often attempted to take one discreet bite only to spend several minutes trying to manage the fallout. Powdered sugar drifted gently onto gowns. Rogue crumbs landed on polished shoes. Someone always dropped a tart at the worst possible moment, and someone else always stepped in it. Fruit pyramids brought their own drama. These towering displays featured apples, oranges, grapes, figs, and other imported delicacies arranged like edible architecture. The higher the pyramid, the more impressive the host appeared. But fruit pyramids were also dangerous. One wrong pull and the entire structure could collapse like a citrus avalanche. Guests circled them cautiously, trying to select a piece that wouldn't trigger catastrophe. The bravest souls went for the grapes dangling temptingly near the top, while the rest quietly plucked items from the base, pretending they preferred them that way. Then there were the meats. Ah yes, the questionably timed, questionably heated, and occasionally questionably identifiable meats. Georgian cuisine loved its savoury dishes, but the ballroom setting didn't always love them back. A tray of sliced beef might sit slightly longer than ideal. A platter of cold ham might be more interpretively warm than safely chilled. Mixed with the heat of a crowded ballroom and the proximity of hundreds of candles, the refreshments table sometimes felt like a culinary gamble orchestrated for the guests' bravery. People approached these meats with hope, caution, and a strong awareness of their evening wear. Other savoury offerings included miniature pies, spiced rolls, and delicately seasoned bites designed to be eaten in a single controlled motion. But controlled motions were difficult when wearing restrictive clothing. Corsets and stiff coats did not support enthusiastic chewing. Guests tried to appear effortless while secretly counting how many seconds they had before their next breath. Men occasionally took too large bites and then spent entire dances regretting their choices. Women took much smaller bites but ran the risk of crumbs falling into the folds of their gowns, an indignity no one wanted to acknowledge. Etiquette demanded that eating be discreet and graceful. Loud chewing was unacceptable. Overindulgence was scandalous, and reaching for food with too much enthusiasm suggested a lack of refinement. This meant guests navigated the table with the calm, deliberate movements of people who desperately wanted a tart but were pretending they could take it or leave it. Even thirst was a delicate matter. Drinking too much punch hinted at gluttony. Drinking too little hinted that the host's recipe was questionable. The correct approach required balance, a light sip, a thoughtful nod, perhaps a polite comment on the citrus notes. The refreshment table was also a social hub. People gathered there to catch their breath, exchange gossip, or hide from overly persistent dance partners. Conversations flowed freely as guests nibbled and sipped. Someone commented on the artistry of the fruit pyramid. Someone else subtly criticized the meat. Chaperones hovered nearby, ensuring the area didn't become a zone of unmonitored flirtation. The refreshment table heard every secret, every sigh, and every whispered complaint about shoes. Despite the chaos and occasional culinary confusion, the refreshments were essential. They offered comfort, distraction, and sometimes a welcome excuse to linger. A guest who needed a moment to recover from an embarrassing dance step could retreat to the table with dignity. A gentleman hoping to strike up conversation might offer a tart as an opening. A lady trying to avoid an unwanted dance could claim she was just refreshing herself, though everyone knew this was code for strategically hiding. By the end of the evening, the refreshment table looked as though it had survived a minor storm. The punch bowl sat emptily heroic. The fruit pyramid listed to one side. A few forgotten pastries clung to the edges like survivors of a sugary battle. And yet, this chaos reflected the fullness of the night. The laughter, the nerves, the risks taken, and the dances survived. While guests floated, spun, flirted, and judged one another under shimmering candlelight, an entirely different world powered the Georgian ballroom from the shadows. It was a world of rapid footsteps, hushed orders, polished shoes, and relentless work performed by people who were absolutely essential and almost entirely invisible. The good news? The ball is flawless. The bad news? That's because 40 servants haven't sat down since sunrise. Behind every elegant moment was a servant racing to make it happen. Ballroom glamour may have belonged to the guests, but ballroom survival belonged to the staff. Footmen were the most visible, though only barely. They stood at attention near doorways, staircases, and along the edges of the ballroom, poised like decorative statues that could spring into action at any second. Their uniforms were immaculate. Powdered wigs, crisp coats, gleaming buttons, all designed to maintain an air of refinement even while they were quietly performing logistical miracles. A footman's job was a blend of grace, precision, and the ability to anticipate disaster before it appeared. They opened doors, guided arriving guests, rescued dropped fans, intercepted wobbling pastries, and prevented punch from sloshing onto expensive silk. Their faces remained calm, even when everything else was one flickering candle away from catastrophe. Maids, meanwhile, moved with near invisibility, sweeping through corridors and refreshment rooms like benevolent ghosts. They replaced napkins, collected empty plates, managed spills before anyone noticed, and stood ready with clean cloths, sewing kits, and the emotional stamina required to handle whispered requests from frantic guests. Maids learned to navigate the household's social hierarchy with the grace of diplomats. They had to be helpful, swift, and silent, but never intrusive. A good maid could tidy an entire refreshment table, while guests stood not 2 feet away, none the wiser that anything had ever been amiss. Candle snuffers, often young servants or apprentices, were the quiet heroes of the night. With hundreds of candles burning at various heights, someone needed to keep them trimmed, replaced, or extinguished as necessary. This was delicate work, too slow, and wax dripped on priceless floors. Too careless, and a flame grew too tall, threatening a wig or garland. Too loud, and they drew attention, unacceptable during a dance. Candle snuffers moved through the ballroom with tools in hand. Snuffers, hooks, wax scrapers, and the constant awareness that open flame plus flammable fabric was a combination requiring the reflexes of a cat and the patience of a saint. Punch guards, unofficial but absolutely real, were those servants assigned to the punch bowl, stationed like loyal soldiers protecting a sacred relic. Their task was to ensure the ladle stayed full, cups stayed clean, and no guest had the opportunity to lean too far forward and ruin the evening, or fall in. Punch guards also monitored consumption. Too much enthusiasm near the punch bowl required gentle but firm redirection. They knew the signs: the overly animated laugh, the slightly unsteady step, the way someone might begin telling a story too loudly. A punch guard could prevent an entire scandal simply by stepping forward with a fresh cup of water. Musicians, though technically hired rather than household servants, also existed in this liminal space between visibility and invisibility. The orchestra played tirelessly, adjusting tempo, maintaining energy, and pretending not to notice the occasional dancer tripping in their line of sight. They communicated with each other through small nods or shifts in rhythm, interpreting the emotional temperature of the ballroom and shaping it accordingly. In many ways, the musicians were emotional servants, silently supporting the room's atmosphere, ensuring that every dance felt seamless, even when the dancers themselves were far from perfect. Behind the ballroom, chaos reigned in the servants' quarters, hallways and staircases. This was where refreshments were prepared, plates washed, pastry crumbs rescued, and emergencies handled. A maid might sprint to retrieve a clean handkerchief for a crying guest. A footman might discreetly fetch a shawl for someone seated near a draught. Someone else might be rushing to replace a fallen decoration before anyone spotted it. Servants communicated with glances, gestures, and the occasional whispered instruction, an entire language built from efficiency and exhaustion. And then there was the coordination. Servants were choreographed almost as intricately as the guests on the dance floor. One footman replaced burnt-out candles while another stabilized the ladder. Maids lined up fresh trays just as the previous ones emptied. A senior servant monitored the ebb and flow of the night, dispatching helpers to whichever corner threatened to descend into chaos. Even the act of discreetly removing a collapsed pastry pyramid, it happened more often than society would admit, was handled like a covert military operation. Servants also managed emotional emergencies. A tearful guest seeking privacy. A maid guided her gently to a quiet room. A gentleman fainting from heat or corset strain. Yes, corset strained them too. A footman caught him before he hit the floor. A nervous dancer needing water, already on the way. A chaperone whose glare had reached dangerous intensity. Tea was quietly placed in her hand before her suspicion levels reached critical mass. What made their work even more extraordinary was that guests rarely acknowledged it. Servants were expected to maintain the illusion of effortlessness. If they were seen working too hard, the illusion cracked. Their presence was allowed, but their labour was not meant to exist in the minds of the wealthy, so they perfected the art of being important without being visible, skilled without being praised, exhausted without being permitted to show it. By the end of the night, as guests departed glowing and satisfied, servants still worked, cleaning floors, extinguishing candles, collecting forgotten dance cards, and restoring order to the ballroom. Their day did not end when the music stopped. It ended when the last crumb was gone, the final candle snuffed, and the house returned to its pre-ball stillness. The ball's glamour belonged to the guests, but its success belonged entirely to the servants. Without them, nothing would shine, nothing would move smoothly, and nothing would survive the first spilled punch. While the ballroom shimmered with candlelight and polite conversation, an entirely different dance unfolded beneath the elegance, a slow, dangerous waltz of whispers, rumours, and calculated social attacks. No weapon in Georgian society cut as sharply as well-placed gossip, and no battlefield was more suited to its deployment than the ballroom. One whispered rumour could ruin your season faster than tripping in front of the Duke. Gossip was not merely entertainment, it was currency, influence, and sometimes vengeance. Families treated information the way generals treated troop movements, with strategy, secrecy, and devastating intent when necessary. A simple observation, someone's flushed cheeks, an ill-timed laugh, or a questionable dance partner, could morph into a narrative by the time it reached the opposite corner of the room, and once a story started its journey, stopping it was nearly impossible. The most skilled gossipers didn't look like schemers. They appeared serene, graceful, and deeply uninterested in anyone else's business. Naturally, this was a lie. These were the people who knew exactly where to stand to overhear a conversation without appearing to listen. who could tilt their heads at precisely the right angle to catch a reflection in a mirror, and who wielded fans like coded transmitters. Behind a single flutter of lace, entire sentences unfolded. Did you see her gown? Was he invited? I heard. Fan whispers were the purest form of ballroom espionage. A lady could hide her mouth completely while delivering information that would detonate across the room 5 minutes later. Observers saw nothing but a charming flutter. Meanwhile, alliances shifted, reputations trembled, and a chaperone somewhere felt a sudden instinctive chill. Family rivalries amplified this quiet warfare. Some households competed for prestige, influence, or the same marriage prospects. Others held grudges so old no one remembered their origin, but everyone remembered the obligation to maintain them. A dance misinterpreted as favoritism could trigger outrage. A perceived slight, real or imagined, could spark an entire season of strategic whispers designed to humble, embarrass, or gently dismantle a rival's social standing. Rumours came in all varieties. Some were harmless, merely embellishments of daily life. Someone buying new property, someone's cousin seen in questionable company, someone's shoes squeaking suspiciously. These were warm-up rumours, designed to loosen tongues and test the conversational waters. The truly dangerous ones, however, focused on character, morality, or marriage prospects. A rumour implying unreliability, impropriety, or financial instability could spread like spilled ink across silk. No apology could fully erase it. These rumours often began with an expert in the art of accidental revelation. A lady might sigh softly and say, "It's such a shame. Poor Miss Hensley looked pale tonight," knowing full well the words would be twisted into Miss Hensley is ill, then Miss Hensley is unwell, then Miss Hensley is unfit, all before the orchestra finished tuning. Another might casually mention seeing someone enter a shop at an odd hour. The implication required no explanation. Observers filled in the blanks themselves. Men were not immune to this dance of destruction. Their reputations could falter with equal speed. An overheard joke interpreted as rude, a perceived slight to another gentleman, or an innocent conversation with a married woman misread as scandalous. A gentleman's honour lived or died on the ballroom floor, and one misjudged interaction could follow him for years. The remarkable part was how subtle the destruction could be. It took only 2 sentences, carefully crafted, casually delivered, to initiate catastrophe. "I worry Lady So-and-so is overwhelmed. She's looked terribly strained." Translation: "Something is wrong with her." Or, "Mr. Langford seems distracted tonight." Translation: "He's unreliable." The vagueness was intentional. Leaving room for interpretation created more room for panic. Yet gossip wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was strangely communal. A particularly shocking moment, a fainting guest, a missing shoe, an accidentally extinguished wig, could become the ballroom's collective story for the evening. These tales spread warmly, humorously, and with shared amusement. But even harmless gossip could become a spark for rivalry if delivered to the wrong listener. Reputation warfare also included strategic silence. Ignoring someone's presence, failing to greet them properly, or declining a dance without a solid excuse sent powerful messages. These weren't accidents. They were precision strikes executed with a serene smile. Guests learned to read the subtle shifts, who avoided whom, who greeted warmly, who greeted coldly, who offered polite praise a shade too polished to be sincere. The ballroom's mirrors only intensified the paranoia. Everyone could see everyone else seeing everyone else. A glance held too long became suspicious. A whisper shared too closely became incriminating. A pair leaving the floor at the same time inspired entire fictional storylines whispered into fans like serialized novels. Navigating this terrain required expertise. The socially astute avoided giving anyone ammunition. They maintained perfect composure, carefully neutral expressions, and practiced restraint in their words. The inexperienced, however, walked straight into traps without realizing the danger until the next morning, when they awoke to learn they had become the topic of 10 conversations and 3 lightly scandalized breakfasts. And yet gossip was also thrilling. It added a dangerous sparkle to the evening, a sense that beneath all the elegance lay something unpredictable. The ballroom was polite society's theatre, but its hidden drama was what made the night unforgettable. If the Georgian Ballroom sparkled like a dream, the bill behind it hit like a nightmare. Hosting a ball wasn't simply expensive, it was financial theatre. Every candle, every rose, every flute of wine carried a price tag quietly screaming in the background, while guests murmured politely about such a lovely evening. Hosting a ball cost so much that your wallet didn't just cry, it fainted. To understand the true cost, begin with the most deceptively expensive element, candles. A single large ball could require hundreds, sometimes thousands, burning in chandeliers, wall sconces, candelabras, and decorative stands. Beeswax candles, the only socially acceptable type for fashionable gatherings, were astonishingly pricey. Each one burned for only a few hours, which meant a full ballroom needed constant replacements throughout the night. Hosts essentially turned money into fire, literally. And those perfect lighting effects, soft glows, flattering shadows, shimmering reflections, weren't just artistic choices, they were financial sacrifices. Then came the musicians. Orchestras were not optional. A ball without music was simply a crowded room of uncomfortable people pretending not to notice the silence. Hiring a talented ensemble cost dearly. Musicians needed payment, food, possibly lodging, and the assurance they would not be forced to play in a drafty corner where their instruments might go out of tune. A highly skilled group, capable of keeping perfect tempo and rescuing dancers from rhythmic disaster, was worth their weight in gold. Hosts who wanted to impress hired larger ensembles, stacking instrumentalists like luxury accessories. Food and drink drained the budget further. Preparing enough refreshments for dozens or hundreds of guests required vast quantities of ingredients, hours of labour, and a kitchen full of cooks who might or might not be emotionally stable after building a fruit pyramid for the 6th time. Imported fruits were especially costly. Oranges, pineapples, figs, and grapes all served as edible status symbols. Meat dishes demanded quality cuts. Pastries required sugar, still a luxury in many households. And then there was the punch. Fine wines, imported spirits, exotic spices, and citrus fruits formed the punch bowl's foundation, and constructing a punch of respectable potency could cost more than furnishing a small room. Even drinkware contributed to the expense. Delicate crystal cups or fine porcelain bowls needed polishing, storage, and occasional replacement when a nervous guest inevitably dropped one. Servants carried trays of fragile glasses with the stoic awareness that each one cost more than their monthly wage. A well-run refreshment table didn't just consume resources, it devoured them. Decorations provided another route for financial ruin. Flowers were required in quantities that bordered on agricultural. Garlands adorned staircases, tables, alcoves, and sometimes door frames. Floral arrangements towered dramatically, built not for fragrance but for spectacle. Fresh blooms, depending on the season, required careful sourcing or greenhouse cultivation. Ribbons, fabrics, and ornamental pieces added layers of visual richness. Guests might whisper, "How lovely the decor is!" without realizing the host had taken out a loan against next year's rent. And then there was the room itself. Maintaining a ballroom was an expensive hobby. Floors needed polishing to a treacherous shine. Mirrors demanded relentless cleaning. Curtains required laundering and repair. Heating the enormous space, before it filled with warm bodies, consumed an impressive amount of fuel. Some families built temporary extensions or rented additional spaces to accommodate especially grand events. Venue upkeep wasn't an afterthought. It was a continuous, financially draining commitment. Staff costs also stacked up. A single ball required a small army of workers: footmen, maids, stable hands, butlers, cooks, musicians' assistants, punch guards, candle snuffers, and the occasional extra hired for crowd management or decorative staging. These workers expected wages, meals, and sometimes hazard pay, particularly if they were stationed near the punch bowl during peak gossip hours. Additional workers were brought in for clean-up afterward. The cost of labour for one night could rival the cost of running a household for weeks. Fashion, too, played a role in the economics of a ball, not for the host directly, but as part of the overall ecosystem. Guests invested in new gowns, tailored coats, powdered wigs, slippers, shawls, jewellery, and gloves. Every guest wanted to appear at their best, and no one wanted to wear something that had already been seen at another event. Tailors and dressmakers lived their most lucrative lives during ball seasons. The social expectation that everyone appear spotless, stylish, and well-funded contributed to the ball's unspoken collective expense. Even invitations and introductions weren't free. High-quality stationery, calligraphy, wax seals, decorative flourishes all added subtle costs, Couriers delivered invitations, often travelling long distances, because sending such important messages by average post was deemed unthinkably vulgar. Everything related to the ball, even the way it began, whispered money. So why did families endure such financial acrobatics? Prestige. Hosting a grand ball elevated a household's reputation, cemented alliances, attracted desirable marriage opportunities, and demonstrated economic power. It was a public declaration. We belong at the top. A successful ball could raise a family's standing overnight. A poorly executed one could invite humiliation. Every candle, every pastry, every hireling, every thread of silk served the same purpose: to create an unforgettable night that would be discussed for weeks, admired for months, and envied for years. Hosts paid enormous sums for a fleeting, glittering moment where their household shone brightest, and the next morning, the bill arrived, the glamour faded, the servants collapsed, the hosts stared into the financial abyss. But once the exhaustion wore off, someone inevitably said, "We should do this again next season." If the Georgian ballroom was a glittering battlefield of glances, gossip, and graceful steps, then chaperones were the tense, ever-vigilant sentinels guarding its borders. These women, mothers, aunts, widows, governesses, and occasionally professionals hired for the sole purpose of vigilance, watched every movement with the intensity of someone monitoring priceless artwork in a room full of toddlers. Their job? Prevent scandal. Their hobby? Assume everything is a scandal. A chaperone's authority was absolute. Young unmarried women could not simply wander the ballroom as they pleased. They required escort, supervision, and the silent blessing of the woman assigned to protect their reputation. In a society where one ill-timed moment of closeness could doom a girl's marital prospects, chaperones took their role very, very seriously. This wasn't merely parental concern. It was the enforcement branch of social survival. Every chaperone came equipped with an internal alarm system capable of detecting impropriety before it even happened. If a conversation lingered too long, their eyes narrowed. If a gentleman leaned in a bit too closely, their fan snapped shut like a warning signal. If a girl laughed too freely, the chaperone's head turned so quickly one feared she might sprain something. They surveyed the ballroom with the focus of seasoned generals studying enemy troop movements. They stationed themselves strategically. Some chose chairs along the walls, selecting prime vantage points where they could monitor at least 4 conversations and 3 potential dances at once. Others stood near refreshment tables, pretending to admire pastries while actually surveilling every young person within pastry range. And some preferred to hover near doorways, ensuring no couple slipped away to a hallway or garden where shadows and trouble lurked. Chaperones communicated through subtlety. A raised eyebrow delivered a warning sharper than any spoken reprimand. A slight purse of the lips could stop a gentleman mid-compliment. A pointed clearing of the throat could scatter a flirtatious conversation like startled pigeons. Fans, shawls, and handkerchiefs became tools in their arsenal, silent, elegant props used to signal displeasure, summon daughters, or block a particularly concerning line of sight. Mothers were often the most intense chaperones. They carried the crushing responsibility of launching their daughters into society, and failure was not an option. If a mother sensed danger, real or imagined, she swooped in with maternal efficiency, inserting herself between flirtatious youths with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She might say something perfectly polite like, "My dear, we must greet Lady Pembroke," while internally thinking, "Not on my watch, young man." Aunts brought their own flavour of vigilance, the mix of maternal protectiveness with a flair for theatrics. An aunt could spot romance from across the ballroom and would stomp it out with the enthusiasm of someone swatting a persistent fly. Widowed chaperones, meanwhile, carried an air of solemn authority. They had seen things, they had lived life, and they were determined no one else would repeat history under their supervision. Hired chaperones, often widows or respectable older women in need of income, took their duties with professional dedication. They maintained respectful distance but kept their senses sharp. Some were known for being kind and discreet. Others were rumoured to possess eyes in the back of their heads, capable of catching whispered conversations at 20 paces. Daughters had mixed feelings about their guardians. On the one hand, chaperones protected them from predatory suitors, wandering reputations, and the pitfalls of naive excitement. On the other hand, they also protected them from fun. A young lady might long for a moment alone, just long enough for a meaningful exchange of words, but chaperones treated alone as synonymous with scandal brewing. Even lingering too long by a window could prompt intervention. Gentlemen, for their part, approached the chaperone with the careful respect one gives a sleeping lion. Before requesting a dance, they bowed politely, offered compliments, and demonstrated their harmless intentions. A chaperone gauged everything: his tone, his manners, his coat quality, and whether his handshake looked trustworthy. A single misjudged gesture could result in a chaperone's disapproving stare marking him for the rest of the night. Not all chaperones were strict, of course. Some delighted in facilitating romance, as long as it was appropriate romance. These softer guardians gave young couples a few extra seconds together, pretended not to notice a shy exchange of smiles, or allowed conversations to continue as long as they stayed within acceptable proximity. These chaperones were treasured, adored, and quietly celebrated by grateful daughters everywhere. Yet even the gentlest chaperone experienced moments of panic. A sudden absence of a daughter from immediate sight could cause a spike of terror, unmatched by any ballroom drama. They swept through crowds, scanning faces with the speed and precision of a hawk until their missing charge reappeared, often doing something harmless, like adjusting a glove. Chaperones also monitored other chaperones. Whisper networks among guardians were powerful. They shared concerns, observed patterns, and occasionally joined forces to intercept flirtations that seemed too daring. A group of chaperones aligned on a mission was a force of nature, swift, immovable, and devastatingly effective. Despite their intensity, chaperones played a crucial role in maintaining order. Without them, the ballroom would devolve into a chaotic swirl of unsupervised flirtation, whispered promises, and questionable alliances. They were the quiet keystones holding polite society together, guarding reputations, preserving decorum, and ensuring the night unfolded with dignity. By the end of the evening, chaperones were often more exhausted than the dancers. Their eyes had scanned every corner, their nerves had endured countless near scares, their fans had flapped like wings. They went home with aching feet, sore backs, and the satisfaction of having successfully prevented disaster, even if the only disaster was a gentleman leaning half an inch too close. If the twirling dancers and fluttering fans were the visible scenery of a Georgian ball, then the real plot unfolded quietly at the edges, where conversations lingered, heads leaned closer, and polite smiles masked negotiations. A Georgian ball was like LinkedIn, but with more lace and fewer honest intentions. Beneath the glittering surface lay a world of deals, debts, alliances, and subtle maneuvers that shaped fortunes far more than any dance step. In a society where reputation meant power, the ballroom was the perfect venue for those seeking to advance their interests. Everyone important was there. Landowners, merchants, politicians, officers, heiresses, lawyers, clergy, all gathered in an environment that encouraged conversation, observation, and the gentle manipulation of both. A well-timed comment could win an ally. A poorly timed one could undo years of careful relationship building. Men often used the ballroom as an unofficial meeting ground. While their wives and daughters danced, they gathered near doorways, alcoves, and refreshment tables, exchanging updates about estates, tenancies, harvests, or investments. They discussed pending legislation, local scandals, and opportunities for mutual benefit. These conversations looked casual, but they were calculated. A compliment about a man's coat might precede a request for a business favour. A remark about the weather might be a preface to negotiating a land lease. Every interaction held strategic potential. Politicians especially thrived in the ballroom environment. They circulated with practiced charm, bowing to ladies, greeting hosts warmly, and casually planting seeds of influence. A dance was an excuse to approach someone whose support they needed. A shared laugh in a corner could transform into a whispered alliance. Promises made during a minuet often carried more weight than those made in Parliament the next day. After all, political alliances forged under candlelight had a way of feeling personal, even if they weren't. Merchants and rising industrial families understood the ballroom's value too. Though not born into aristocratic privilege, they used these social gatherings to strengthen their connections with the upper classes. They offered investment opportunities, suggested partnerships, or hinted at lucrative ventures. Old money rarely admitted needing new money. But both sides understood the unspoken exchange. Prestige for capital, capital for access. Ladies participated in their own networking, though often through different channels. While dancing or conversing, they exchanged information about marriages, inheritances, dowries, illnesses, and family changes. These conversations shaped social strategy. A mother might learn which family was struggling financially and adjust her matchmaking ambitions accordingly. A young woman might discover potential allies among those who shared her circumstances. Even compliments on fashion could disguise deeper inquiries. Where was the gown ordered? Who financed it? How successful is the household this season? Chaperones unintentionally contributed to networking as well. Their constant supervision placed them in key observational positions. They overheard everything, noticed trends, and frequently passed along information, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. A chaperone's casual remark about a gentleman's character could ripple through the ballroom, influencing whether he received invitations in the future. Debts, social, financial, and emotional, were also navigated under the chandeliers. A gentleman might subtly remind another of a favour granted the previous season. A lady might exchange introductions with someone she intended to call upon later. A family in decline might seek to strengthen ties with those who could help restore their fortunes. The ballroom's cordial atmosphere concealed a complex web of obligations and expectations, each thread tugged gently by those hoping to pull themselves into a better position. Of course, not all deals were grand or political. Some were quietly domestic. Two mothers might agree to share information about dressmakers. Two gentlemen might arrange a hunting trip. Someone might discreetly request an introduction to a relative who was rumoured to be eligible and wealthy. Even the orchestra felt the influence. A well-placed compliment to the lead violinist could ensure your favourite dance was played at the perfect moment. Secrecy was woven into these exchanges. The ballroom, for all its openness, offered surprising privacy. The hum of music, the movement of dancers, and the shifting clusters of guests created small pockets of solitude. A conversation whispered behind a pillar. A hand briefly touching an arm in reassurance. A glance exchanged across the room confirming an agreement reached earlier. The architecture, music, and social etiquette combined to create cover for delicate negotiations. But secrecy could backfire. Say too much to the wrong person, and your intentions became fodder for gossip. Align with the wrong family and your standing slipped. Promise something you couldn't deliver, and you gained an enemy instead of an ally. The ballroom was both opportunity and trap, where one careless statement could undo an entire strategy. Networking often continued even while dancing. Partners exchanged low-voiced remarks as they stepped, turned, and glided past others. A gentleman might suggest a future meeting. A lady might drop hints about her family's prospects. Though conversations had to remain polite and subtle, many arrangements were born between the rhythmic sequences of the dance. By the end of the night, the ballroom had hosted more than festivities. It had orchestrated negotiations. Some alliances strengthened, some rivalries deepened, and some futures shifted quietly beneath the music. Guests left with more than memories. They left with new plans, fresh ambitions, and carefully planted promises. A Georgian ball wasn't simply a social event. It was an entire marketplace of influence wrapped in silk and candlelight, where every word mattered and every gesture carried weight. Even the most meticulously orchestrated Georgian ball, complete with flawless servants, shimmering candlelight, polished floors, and well-rehearsed dancers, was never immune to chaos. For all its elegance, the ballroom secretly thrived on disaster. Because where there are wigs, layers of silk, slippery shoes, open flames, fragile pastries, and nervous people packed into a room pretending to be perfect, something will go wrong. The good news? The disaster was small. The bad news? Everyone saw it. One of the most common ballroom tragedies involved torn gowns. Georgian fashion, while beautiful, was not designed for athletic movement or unexpected entanglements. All it took was one stray heel, one partner stepping half an inch in the wrong direction, or one enthusiastic turn for disaster to strike. A delicate hem snagged on a shoe buckle, a ribbon caught on a decorative chair, a lace sleeve brushed too close to a gentleman's coat button. Suddenly a lady found herself clutching part of her gown with both hands, praying she could sneak to the edge of the room before anyone noticed. Of course, everyone did notice. The orchestra played on, but eyes followed the wobbling silhouette making its way toward a chaperone with the urgency of someone fleeing danger. Spilled punch created its own category of mayhem. Punch bowls were majestic, shimmering centerpieces of the refreshment table, but they were also disasters waiting to happen. One misjudged ladle, one elbow bumped at the wrong moment, and punch sloshed over the edge like a sugary tidal wave. A gentleman might attempt to save the bowl with heroic instincts, only to send a cascade across the tablecloth, the floor, and the nearest guests. Silk gowns were stained, shoes soaked, wigs threatened, and the punch guards descended in a flurry of towels and controlled panic. Meanwhile, those observing whispered sympathetically until the poor soul responsible left the room, after which the whispered sympathy turned into lively storytelling. Fainting was practically a ballroom tradition. Between tight corsets, crowded rooms, intense candlelight, and the anxiety of performing social perfection for hours, someone usually reached their physical limit. A lady might be mid-dance when her vision blurred, her breath shortened, and she folded gracefully, or not so gracefully, into her partner's arms. This caused immediate ripple effects. Dancers halted, chaperones gasped, servants rushed forward with water, and nearby guests offered dramatic commentary. "The heat," one declared. "The pressure," another whispered. Quiet conversations began at once. Was she ill? Overwhelmed? Secretly in love? Dramatic fainting didn't ruin the night. It rewrote it. And then there were the candle mishaps. Open flames plus wigs plus fabrics equals a nightly gamble. While major fires were thankfully rare, smaller incidents occurred more often than anyone dared admit. A gentleman leaning too close to a wall sconce might discover his sleeve smouldering at the edges. A lady passing beneath a chandelier risked her feathered hairpiece briefly catching a spark. Servants reacted with astonishing speed, snuffing flames before disaster spread, but the lingering smell of burnt feathers told the tale. Guests tried pretending nothing had happened, but every nose in the ballroom twitched. Footwear invited another realm of chaos. Georgian shoes were stylish but not always stable. Ballroom floors, polished to mirror-like smoothness, offered elegance at the cost of traction. A gentleman might glide magnificently, or slide into the next couple with all the grace of a startled deer. Ladies, balancing on delicate heels, occasionally discovered that the floor had ambitions of sending them airborne. Shoe buckles snapped, soles peeled. A heel caught in a hem could topple even the most practiced dancer. The orchestra valiantly pretended to notice nothing, but dancers exchanging wide-eyed looks told a different story. Orchestra blunders were rarer but unforgettable. A violinist breaking a string mid-dance sent a sharp twang echoing through the room. A flautist missing a cue created a moment of discord that dancers felt in their bones. Sometimes the conductor misread the room and sped up the tempo too soon, sending dancers scrambling through steps as if performing a comedy routine. Other times, a harpsichord key stuck, producing an unfortunate sustained note that lingered awkwardly through the next measure. These moments became instant legends whispered among musicians and guests alike. Decorative accidents offered additional entertainment. A ribbon loosened from its perfect bow. A floral arrangement toppled dramatically. A fruit pyramid collapsed in slow motion, spilling grapes and citrus across the table like a biblical plague. Guests nearby tried to maintain composure while deciding whether to help or pretend nothing had happened. Servants swept in to rescue the scene with impressive precision, restoring order in minutes while guests exchanged delighted glances. Social chaos also erupted in tiny ways. A gentleman bowing too deeply might experience an unexpected wig shift, sending powdered curls sliding off at a tragic angle. Two ladies curtsying simultaneously could bump skirts, nearly bouncing off one another like elaborately dressed balloons. A whispered comment might be overheard by the wrong person. A pair might accidentally stand too close and trigger an entire chaperone squad to converge. But perhaps the most chaotic moments were those created by pure misunderstanding. A gentleman offering his hand to the wrong lady, a dance partner switching places one beat too soon, two couples attempting to occupy the same corner of the floor, a timid guest mistaking a gesture for an invitation, and stepping forward at precisely the wrong moment. These tiny social derailments, while harmless, sent waves of amusement through the crowd. Yet for all the mishaps, chaos rarely ruined a Georgian ball. In fact, it added personality, warmth, and a touch of unpredictability. Guests relished these moments. They gave people stories to tell, memories to share, and gossip to savour. No ball was ever perfect, but the imperfect ones, those were the balls everyone remembered. As the night stretched onward and the dancers' smiles grew increasingly strained, the Georgian ballroom prepared for one of its most cherished rituals, the midnight meal. Served long after the sensible world had gone to sleep, this feast was a lavish, groaning display of meats, fish, sweets, puddings, and dishes that made guests wonder whether they were hungry or simply too exhausted to protest. Midnight supper didn't energize you, it just reminded you how long you'd been pretending to have fun. The transition from dancing to dining was almost ceremonial. The orchestra played a final flourish, dancers executed one last bow, and the host gave a subtle signal. Suddenly, doors that had been closed all evening swung open to reveal tables groaning under the weight of culinary ambition. Guests drifted toward them in a dreamlike procession, gowns rustling, shoes dragging, stomachs rumbling, and minds halfway convinced this feast was an illusion born of fatigue. The midnight table was no modest spread. It was a monumental performance of hospitality. Large platters of roasted meats dominated the centre, beef glazed to a shine, ham studded with cloves, fowl cooked with herbs and citrus, and sometimes an extravagant centrepiece like a whole peacock, its feathers reattached purely for spectacle. The sight of such culinary theatre caused guests to murmur politely, though some wondered whether the bird was intended to be eaten or admired. Fish dishes occupied another section of the table. Salmon poached in wine, trout decorated with sliced lemons, anchovy pastes, and oysters arranged in glistening rows. Cold fish at midnight was a uniquely Georgian experience. It tasted luxurious, refined, and slightly bewildering when consumed by someone who had been dancing for hours on minimal sustenance and maximal stress. Vegetable dishes, though never the stars, made their appearance. Peas cooked in butter, carrots sweetened with sugar, asparagus laid neatly in rows, and potatoes prepared in ways that signalled the cook's creativity or overconfidence. These dishes offered colour, balance, and the faint promise of virtue amid the indulgence, but it was the sweets that truly stole the show. Georgian dessert tables were ambitious, towers of biscuits, delicate pastries, moulded jellies, custards in porcelain dishes, iced cakes, fruit tarts, candied citrus peels, marzipan sculptures, everything designed to dazzle the eyes before challenging the stomach. Sugar was expensive, so a generous dessert table was a public announcement of wealth. Guests drifted through this landscape of sweetness with equal parts admiration and caution, trying to look composed while computing how much longer their corsets could tolerate pudding. The midnight meal was not eaten seated, at least not in the leisurely sense. Space was limited, and no one wanted to risk crushing their elaborate clothing by sitting incorrectly. Instead, guests balanced plates delicately, moving in slow, careful steps to avoid collisions. Eating became a performance. Small bites, controlled chewing, polite nods. Some foods required more bravery than others. Cold meats could be unwieldy. Sticky pastries clung to fingers like affectionate pets. Soft jellies wobbled treacherously on spoons. But refusing food wasn't an option. Politeness demanded participation. Conversation shifted during the meal. Earlier in the night, talk was bright, energetic, and strategic. Now, at this late hour, guests were softened by fatigue, by hunger, by punch. Topics drifted toward comfort. Compliments on the food, observations about the evening, laughter at small mishaps, shared relief at escaping the dance floor. Even rival families took informal truces while chewing. The midnight meal created a kind of vulnerable camaraderie, a collective acknowledgement that everyone had reached the point of mild delirium. But exhaustion shaped everything. Some guests stared blankly at the feast, unsure whether they were genuinely hungry or merely participating out of social obligation. Others enthusiastically filled their plates, grateful for the chance to sit, briefly, before the dancing resumed. A few drifted half awake, moving toward the table as though guided by instinct alone. Servants observed all of this with sympathetic eyes, knowing many guests were operating on sheer determination. The meal also reinvigorated the ballroom in subtle ways. The gentleman who had nearly fainted earlier now revived with a slice of cold beef. A lady who had been too shy to speak much during the evening found herself chatting freely over sweets. Couples lingering at the refreshment table found new excuses to talk, commenting on flavours, sharing tastes, or laughing over the wobbling jelly that nearly escaped someone's plate. For some, The midnight meal marked the real turning point of the evening. It was the moment when formality loosened and humanity peeked through the polished exterior. People sat with slightly slumped shoulders. A few giggles grew louder, eyelids drooped, fans fluttered slower. Chaperones relaxed their posture by a fraction of an inch. Even the orchestra took a small breath before launching into the next series of dances. Of course, no Georgian ball allowed its guests to slip fully into comfort. After the feast, dancing resumed. Guests rose from their brief rest, shoulders squared, smiles reapplied, plates abandoned, dignity restored, or something close to it. The midnight meal was only an interlude, a pause in the performance, a chance to gather strength for the final hours of the night. And when dancers returned to the floor, they did so with fuller stomachs, lighter spirits, and the unmistakable feeling that the evening had shifted into something softer and more surreal. Everything after midnight belonged to that hazy space between elegance and exhaustion. For all the elegance of the ballroom, the mirrored walls, the perfect lighting, the orchestrated dances, it was in the unlit corners of the house where the real stories unfolded. The hallways, stairwell landings, side rooms, and especially the gardens were the true arenas of Georgian romance. Forbidden conversations, trembling confessions, reckless bravery, and the kind of whispered moments that could make or break a reputation all unfolded there, far from the polite choreography of the dance floor. If the garden hedge could talk, it would demand hush money. These accidental encounters were rarely accidental. Young people became masters of subtle timing, slipping away just as the orchestra reached a crescendo or as dancers shifted into a formation that masked their exit. The goal wasn't to vanish entirely, disappearing too long risked a full-scale chaperone search party, but to find just enough quiet space for a meaningful exchange. Hallways were the first line of romantic opportunity. Narrow, dimly lit, and blessedly free of dancing feet, they provided a sense of privacy even when only a few steps away from the crowd. A gentleman might offer his arm to help navigate the corridor, and in those few seconds a world of meaning unfolded. There, away from the constant noise of the ballroom, voices softened. A lady might tilt her head slightly closer. A gentleman's tone became warmer, less formal. Everything felt suspended, just the two of them and the echoing candlelight. But hallways also carried danger. A chaperone could appear at any moment. A passing servant might overhear a fragment of conversation. Another couple might be using the same hallway with the same intention. That risk only heightened the thrill. A pair might exchange a hurried whisper. "I hoped you'd be here tonight," before footsteps sent them darting back into the ballroom with the speed of startled birds. Side rooms offered slightly more refuge. Studies, small parlours, music rooms, or even storage spaces for extra chairs sometimes became brief sanctuaries of romance. Couples rarely stepped fully inside, doing so bordered on scandal, but lingering at the threshold, half hidden by shadows, was common enough. A lady might rest her hand lightly on the doorframe. A gentleman might lean in, careful not to invade propriety but desperate to stretch the moment. Discussions that could never unfold in the ballroom's glare found space to breathe here. Hopes for future dances, quiet admiration, the exchange of a compliment too earnest for public ears. And then there were the gardens, the most dangerous and most irresistible refuge of all. Georgian gardens at night were a paradise woven from moonlight, hedges, gravel paths, and the faint scent of roses. Lanterns lit only the main walkway, leaving the side paths deliciously dark. It was the ideal space for a stolen conversation, a shared joke, or a confession hovering just on the edge of impropriety. No wonder chaperones regarded gardens the way ship captains regard hidden reefs. Beautiful but perilous. A gentleman might offer a lady a breath of cool air between dances, a perfectly respectable suggestion. But the moment they stepped onto the terrace, the evening shifted. The music became distant. The lanterns cast soft halos around the statues. Footsteps muffled on gravel, leaving the pair wrapped in near silence. In those few minutes, emotions felt magnified. Words sounded bolder. Hands brushed accidentally. Hearts raced faster than any reel danced inside. But the garden also tested nerves. Every leaf rustle could be a chaperone. Every distant footstep might be someone searching for them. Couples learned to speak quickly, quietly, poignantly. Confessions were often delivered in fragments, half sentences, trembling phrases, because time was always running out. A gentleman might whisper admiration he'd held back all evening. A lady might let her guard slip long enough to reveal that she too had noticed him before he ever approached her tonight. These tiny, fragile exchanges felt monumental. And the hedge? Oh, the poor hedge! It had seen too much. Half-finished declarations, gentlemen kneeling without meaning to propose, awkward goodbyes due to an approaching lantern. It held secrets no one wanted revealed. Of course, chaperones knew the risks. They floated around the garden entrances like silent watchdogs. If a couple took one step too far from the terrace, a chaperone materialized as if summoned by magic. Her voice, polite but firm, called the young lady back. The walk of shame that followed, back indoors under 10 curious gazes, was enough to make anyone reconsider romantic spontaneity. But even chaperones couldn't maintain perfect vigilance. Secret romance found cracks in the system. A brief hand touch as partners switched during a dance. A folded note passed under a fan, a glance that carried more meaning than a paragraph. By the end of the evening, the ballroom's official events might fade, but these secret moments lingered, etched in memory more vividly than any minuet or pastry. The hallways remembered shy smiles. The side rooms remembered trembling breaths. The garden remembered everything, and while most of these romantic sparks never ignited into full scandal, thanks to timing, self-control, or divine intervention, they remained the heartbeats of the ball. The reason people dressed their best, danced their best, and stared just a moment longer than etiquette allowed. Because beneath all the rules and rituals, Georgian society craved connection. And nowhere was that connection felt more intensely than in the shadows just beyond the ballroom door. No matter how dazzling a Georgian ball appeared, how bright the candles, how perfect the music, how graceful the dancers, there always came a moment when the illusion cracked, usually around hour 6, when every guest collectively realized their bodies had surrendered long ago. The good news? The ball is over. The bad news? You can't feel your legs. The end of a ball was its own peculiar ritual. The orchestra's final notes drifted upward like a sigh. Dancers made their last bows with the stiff elegance of people held together by sheer willpower, and a faint murmur spread through the room. Relief mixed with exhaustion. Gratitude blended with suffering. Smiles loosened. Shoulders sagged. Fans slowed to gentle flutters instead of frantic signalling. Even the chaperones, those iron-willed guardians, relaxed their posture by half an inch, the Georgian equivalent of collapsing into a sofa. Guests knew they must leave gracefully, even if every bone in their body begged for collapse. A lady who had danced for hours now moved as though her gown were made of wet cement. Her wig tilted half a degree to the left, powdered curls drooping like flowers after a storm. Gentlemen tried to maintain their courtly posture, though some leaned subtly against pillars to relieve the weight of shoes that had betrayed them long ago. Every smile was polite. Every step was a negotiation with pain. Carriage retrieval was the final great challenge of the night. Earlier in the evening, guests arrived in grand, carefully timed displays. Now they left in chaotic waves, the driveway transformed into a bottleneck of horses, lanterns, coachmen shouting directions, and exhausted aristocrats trying not to fall asleep standing up. A household servant stood outside with a lantern and a never-ending list, calling out names as if summoning souls to salvation. Families gathered near the entrance, tugging on shawls, adjusting cloaks, or simply staring blankly into the night air, waiting for the universe to deliver transportation. Inside, the slow breakdown of elegance continued. Fans that had once fluttered with coded messages now hung uselessly at guests' sides. Gloves were loosened. Gentlemen rubbed sore shoulders. A few ladies discreetly shifted weight from foot to foot, discovering that their shoes had performed quiet acts of betrayal. Every movement revealed a new ache. Guests no longer floated. They hobbled politely. Wigs suffered the worst. After 6 hours of dancing, sweating, and dodging candle heat, many hairstyles resembled wilted sculptures. Powder clung unevenly. Curls sagged. Feathers drooped like tired birds returning to their nests. Some ladies attempted subtle repairs, slipping pins into strategic places while pretending to listen to final compliments. Others simply accepted defeat. Hair had lost the battle, and dignity would have to carry the night. Servants observed this post-ball decay with sympathetic professionalism. Footmen guided guests toward the exit with gentle precision. Maids quietly collected abandoned handkerchiefs, dropped notes, and half-eaten pastries. Musicians packed away their instruments, their faces radiating the satisfaction of people who had just survived a marathon. Candle snuffers moved quickly along the walls, extinguishing flames that had burned bravely for hours. Yet even at this ungodly hour, social performance continued. Guests exchanged final pleasantries, compliments on gowns, gratitude to the host, promises to call, statements like, "What a marvellous evening," uttered with the hollow enthusiasm of people who had forgotten what comfort felt like. The host, still smiling broadly, stood at the doorway to bid farewell, hiding the knowledge that clean-up would last until sunrise, and that half the candles in the room had melted dramatically out of budget. Then came the true test, boarding the carriage. After hours of standing, dancing, and manoeuvring through crowded halls, guests were asked to descend staircases and cross gravel paths with elegance. Gravity, however, had other plans. A gentleman misjudged a step. A lady's skirt caught on a garden stone. More than one guest entered their carriage sideways because any attempt to kneel or bend normally would have produced alarming internal sounds. Inside the carriage, the transformation was immediate. The moment the doors shut, posture collapsed. Backbones softened. Shoulders slumped. Someone exhaled a noise that sounded like a dying accordion. Corsets groaned. Shoes were kicked off discreetly. Every soul in the carriage shared the same silent thought. We survived. The ride home was a procession of half-asleep aristocrats rolling through the night like weary ghosts. Some whispered about their favourite dances. Some replayed their near scandals with nervous giggles. Others stared into the darkness, reflecting on nothing at all. The horses clopped along the road with the steady rhythm of creatures who, unlike their passengers, had not spent 6 hours pretending to be thrilled. Back in the ballroom, the aftermath unfolded. Servants swept floors now littered with confetti-like remnants of the evening. Crumbs, wilted petals, stray gloves, abandoned programs. The orchestra's platform emptied. Candles dimmed. The once shimmering room faded into quiet, the echoes of laughter and footsteps dissolving into stillness. By morning the spell would break entirely. Guests would awaken sore, bleary, and profoundly grateful for chairs. Some would remember the ball fondly, others would exaggerate its flaws for conversational entertainment, but all would share one universal certainty, that the glamour of a Georgian ball was purchased not with money alone, but with aching feet, collapsing wigs, and the silent suffering of endurance wrapped in satin. No matter how late the ball ended, Georgian society expected everyone to be awake the next morning, alive, presentable, and fully prepared to dissect every moment of the night before. Breakfast didn't energize you, it judged you for what you did last night. And nothing fueled Georgian social life quite like the morning after ritual. A delicate blend of damage control, bragging, speculation, correction, exaggeration, and tactical silence. Households awoke slowly. A faint groan echoed from bedrooms as dancers rolled out of bed, discovering new muscles they didn't know existed. Servants tiptoed through hallways carrying tea trays, doing their best not to rattle the cups. No one wanted noise this early after 6 hours of forced enthusiasm. Powdered wigs lay half-crushed on vanity tables. Shoes sat abandoned like evidence of a crime. Guests stared at their reflection, wondering, was that me smiling at 3 a.m? Why does my shoulder hurt? Did I apologise to someone? Did someone apologise to me? Then came breakfast. The dining table was less a place of nourishment and more a tribunal of truth. Families gathered with stiff posture and strategic expressions, because how one behaved at breakfast determined the narrative for the rest of the week. Parents began carefully. So, how was the ball? A deceptively simple question, loaded like a cannon. Young ladies downplayed everything. "Oh, it was lovely," they murmured while mentally replaying every glance, every dance partner, and every moment of near catastrophe. Young gentlemen attempted a dignified shrug. Quite enjoyable, they claimed, despite having tripped during the final reel and nearly colliding with a musician. Meanwhile, parents leaned forward with predatory interest. They wanted details, names, impressions, mishaps, triumphs, hints of romance, threats of scandal. Their daughters gave vague answers, their sons gave evasive ones. This only made parents hungrier. But what made the morning truly electric was gossip. Fresh, shimmering, piping hot gossip carried through servants, friends, messengers, and those mysterious channels that allowed rumours to travel faster than physics should permit. A family might learn before breakfast that someone fainted dramatically, someone danced too closely, someone stepped on someone important, a wig caught fire, a punch bowl nearly became a casualty, a gentleman was seen twice with the same young lady, and once without a chaperone. Every household processed this news differently. Some celebrated. Your dance card was completely full? Wonderful! Others panicked. You talked to who without me present? And a few immediately deployed strategy. We must invite the Beresfords to tea this week, appear friendly, control the narrative. Narrative control was the true art of the morning after. Families with social sense knew not to wait for rumours to spread. They had to get ahead of them. If a daughter tripped during a waltz, the story became, the floor was unusually slick. If a gentleman forgot a dance, the new version was, there was confusion with the music. If a lady was spotted in the garden with someone questionable, the public explanation transformed into, we stepped outside for air and immediately returned. Instantly, directly, heroically. Apologies were another essential part of the morning. A mother might send a note to the host thanking them for the lovely evening, subtly addressing any mishaps. We so appreciated your hospitality, and I do hope the minor disturbance near the candle stand caused no trouble. A gentleman might pen a brief apology to a lady if he stepped on her gown. A lady might send a graceful message acknowledging a torn hemmers, one of those little misadventures of dancing. These courtesies were bandages on social wounds, some small, some gaping. Bragging took a more delicate form. A family could not openly declare, we were the stars of the ball. Too obvious, too gauche. Instead, they sprinkled comments lightly. So many partners approached. Or, how kind of Miss Fairchild to compliment your dress. Or, such generous remarks were made about our hosting ability. A mother might casually mention that half the room crowded her daughter for dances. Not a brag, simply an observation. But gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was a roadmap for future strategy. Families assessed alliances. Who seemed friendly? Who seemed jealous? Who might be useful later? They analysed rival households' strengths and weaknesses like generals preparing for another campaign. A promising connection made last night became a planned invitation today. A rival's embarrassing moment became a quiet morale boost. A rumoured romance sparked calculations about dowries and inheritances. Breakfast conversations determined who would receive invitations next week, whose friendship was worth cultivating, and which possible matches were worth chasing or abandoning. Mothers wrote lists. Fathers made decisions. Young people sat in silence, trying not to accidentally reveal anything important with their facial expressions. And of course, the servants had their own version of the story, a far more accurate one. They had seen the real disasters, the real awkwardness, the real triumphs. Though they repeated little aloud, their small smiles or raised eyebrows occasionally revealed more than words ever could. By late morning, letters were dispatched. By noon, gossip had spread across town. By evening, new theories had formed, refined, and spread again. The ball lived on, not in its dances or decorations, but in its stories. And by the next day, invitations for the follow-up events began arriving. Because in Georgian society, the morning after wasn't the end of the night, it was the beginning of the next one. After candlelit hours of dancing, gossip, manoeuvring, panicking, smiling through pain, and attempting to keep wigs from collapsing like tired soufflés, one might wonder, why did Georgian society do this to itself? Why did they spend fortunes, sacrifice sleep, risk fainting, and endure blistered feet, all for a single night of orchestrated chaos? The good news? You survived the Georgian ballroom. The bad news? Now you understand why they needed so many wigs. To grasp why Georgian balls made sense, you must understand the world they lived in. The ballroom was not merely a party space. It was a living engine of identity, the heart of social life, and the stage where people became who they wanted others to believe they were. Everything about the Georgian ballroom spoke to a deep cultural need, the desire to be seen, admired, respected, envied, or, at the very least, acknowledged. The ball was a social mirror polished to a blinding shine. First, Georgian balls served as public declarations of status. A family that could host a ball demonstrated wealth, connections, and confidence. Every candle, every tray of sweets, every musician added another layer to the message. We belong at the top, and we can prove it in beeswax. For the guests, simply being invited validated their place within the social hierarchy. A ballroom was both a ladder and a spotlight. Your presence meant something. In a society obsessed with lineage and reputation, attendance was currency. But status was only one part of the equation. Equally important was ritual. Georgian society relied on ceremonies and customs to maintain order: church, dining, courtship, family roles, and of course dancing. Balls offered a structured space where everyone knew the rules, even if the rules sometimes bordered on impossible. Proper steps, proper etiquette, proper behaviour. These rituals provided a sense of continuity and meaning. The elegant movements, the predictable dance patterns, the measured transitions between sets. They created a collective rhythm that reassured people their world was steady, refined, and under control, even when it clearly wasn't. Competition thrived beneath the surface of all this civility. Every ball was a quiet battlefield of impressions. Who received the most invitations? Whose gown was admired? Who danced with the most eligible partners? Who whispered with whom? Georgian society turned socializing into sport, complete with victories and defeats. Families tracked their successes the way merchants tracked profits. A daughter's well-filled dance card was as good as winning a tournament. A gentleman being sought after by several mothers was a triumph. Rivalries sharpened across dance floors, and the ball became a glittering arena where reputations rose or fell through. Gestures as small as a curtsy. Identity played the final and perhaps most profound role. Balls allowed individuals to perform idealized versions of themselves, refined, graceful, witty, charming, confident. In daily life, people were burdened by estate management, family obligations, business worries, and the occasional existential dread of living in a world where your reputation could collapse because someone misinterpreted your eyebrow angle. But in a ballroom, for a few candlelit hours, they could embody the best version of their public self. A shy girl might become magnetic under soft lighting. A nervous gentleman might gain courage with each dance. Even older guests basked in the nostalgia of their youth, remembering when they too were chased across dance cards. The ballroom held an irresistible promise that for one night you could shape how others saw you. Despite the absurdity, the expense, the exhaustion, the aching limbs, Georgian balls created a space where emotion, ambition, and imagination came together. They were theatres where people played roles with sincerity. They were arenas where alliances formed, romances blossomed, and futures quietly shifted. A single dance could ignite hope. A single glance could inspire months of speculation. Guests returned home at dawn, drained yet fulfilled, carrying the sense that they had participated in something grand, dramatic, and affirming. Balls also reinforced community. Not everyone liked everyone else, but gathering together under velvet drapes and chandeliers reminded them that they belonged to the same world, one bound by shared rituals and expectations. Even people who disliked the chaos found comfort in its predictability. It was a beautiful contradiction. A night meant to showcase perfection always dissolved into controlled disorder. Yet the disorder made it real. And yes, there was vanity. Wigs, perfumes, jewels, imported fabrics, elaborate cosmetics. These embellishments were part of the identity play. People loved being admired. They loved the shimmer of candlelight on silk, the sound of applause after a well-executed dance, the thrill of being recognized across a crowded room. Even those who complained about balls secretly cherished the transformation they allowed. Ultimately, Georgian balls made sense not because they were practical, but because they were meaningful. They offered escape from monotony, opportunities for connection, pathways to social advancement, and moments of beauty in a world that often demanded restraint. They made people feel alive, even if half of them were quietly losing circulation in their shoes. And that, perhaps, is why they kept dancing. Because beneath every layer of powder, every polished floor, every practiced smile lay a simple truth. Humans crave spectacle. We crave belonging. We crave stories. And the Georgian ballroom gave them all three in a single unforgettable night.